Far out in the boundless expanse of the open ocean, where the continental shelves plummet into an unfathomable abyss, the surface presents an illusion of total tranquility. The wind gently ripples the blue water. Sunlight scatters across the crests of rolling waves, and seabirds trace lazy circles in the empty sky, their eyes scanning the uppermost layers for the silver flash of a stray fish. It is a world of light, of air, of predictable rhythms. But this bright, sunlit realm is merely the roof of a much darker, far more unforgiving world. Beneath this shifting mirror of the surface lies a vertical landscape of terrifying extremes, a void where light dies, where the cold becomes absolute, and where the physical weight of the ocean itself seeks to crush anything that dares to enter. It is here, traversing the boundary between the light and the crushing dark, that we find the absolute master of the deep. Floating horizontally at the surface, resting just beneath the break of the waves, is an animal of almost incomprehensible scale, the sperm whale. Its massive, rectangular head alone makes up a third of its entire body length. Its skin is thick, heavily wrinkled, and etched with a chaotic map of pale, jagged scars, a silent testament to decades spent surviving the ocean's hidden battlefields. From a distance, its movements appear sluggish, almost leisurely. Every few minutes, a sudden, explosive plume of mist erupts from its blowhole, angled sharply to the left, catching the sunlight in a fleeting rainbow before the animal draws in another massive intake of air. It looks peaceful, but this lingering at the surface is not a state of rest. It is a state of intense, highly calculated biological preparation. The sperm whale is not a creature of the sunlit shallows. It is merely a visitor here. Its true domain lies thousands of meters below, in a realm where human machines fracture and implode. To understand the journey this animal is about to undertake, we must first understand the true nature of oceanic pressure. For every 10 meters you descend into the sea, the weight of the water above adds another entire atmosphere of pressure. By the time you reach the twilight zone, the force pressing inward on every square inch of body is equivalent to the weight of a small car. By the time you reach 3,000 meters, the midnight zone, the hunting grounds of sperm whale, that pressure has magnified to thousands of kilograms, bearing down relentlessly on every single square centimeter. For almost any other air-breathing mammal on Earth, these conditions are a death sentence. The physical laws of the universe dictate that under such immense force, air-filled spaces must compress, lungs rupture, ribs shatter, organs distort until they fail. The gases forced into the bloodstream turn toxic. The deep ocean is designed to destroy anything built for the surface. And yet, the sperm whale prepares to plunge directly into it. The survival of this leviathan begins with a breath. Unlike a terrestrial predator that breathes continuously while running down its prey, the sperm whale must take everything it needs for the next hour and a half down into the dark with it. As it rests at the surface, taking deep, rhythmic breaths, it is not merely filling its lungs. It is fundamentally altering the chemistry of its blood and its muscles. The oxygen pulled from the sea air is rapidly bound to specialized molecules, hemoglobin in the blood and massive, concentrated quantities of myoglobin in the muscle tissue. The whale's muscles are so saturated with myoglobin that the flesh itself is almost black. It is stockpiling life, locking oxygen deep into its tissues, so that it will not need to rely on its lungs at all. Once the biochemical vault is full, the preparation is complete. The whale arches its back, lifting its enormous, muscular tail flukes high into the air, water cascading off the trailing edges like rain. And then, with a single, devastatingly powerful downward stroke, it vanishes. The descent is a masterclass in controlled surrender. Within minutes, the bright, shimmering blue of the surface fades into a muted indigo, and then bleeds into an absolute, suffocating black. The temperature plummets to just above freezing. The weight of the water begins to build, pressing inward from all sides of a grip that grows tighter by the second. For most animals, this is a moment of panic, the moment the body attempts to fight back against the crushing force of the deep. But evolution has taught the sperm whale a completely different philosophy of survival. It does not fight the pressure. It yields to it. The greatest vulnerability of any diving mammal is its lungs. If a creature were to drag a rigid, air-filled cavity down into the abyss, the surrounding pressure would eventually smash it to pieces. The sperm whale nullifies this threat through an adaptation that defies logic. It deliberately allows its own lungs to collapse. As the whale sinks deeper, the unimaginable weight of the ocean pushes against its chest. But instead of thick, rigid bones designed to hold the chest cavity open, the sperm whale possesses a ribcage connected by highly flexible, specialized cartilage. As the pressure mounts, the ribcage simply folds inward. It collapses upon itself like a deflating accordion. The delicate air sacs within the lungs, the alveoli, are squeezed completely flat. This collapse is not an injury. It is a profound evolutionary shield. By forcing the air out of the delicate gas exchange tissues of the lungs and up into the reinforced, rigid airways of the trachea, the whale stops the transfer of gases into its bloodstream. Down here, under this intense compression, nitrogen gas becomes a lethal narcotic, and if it were to saturate the blood, it would bubble and boil as the whale returned to the surface, a deadly condition known as the bends. By crushing its own lungs, the sperm whale shuts off the danger completely. Its chest is compressed to a fraction of its normal size. The air is locked away. The lungs are offline. Yet, as the whale continues its plunge into the midnight zone, deeper than light has ever reached, its body must continue to function. The heart must beat. The brain must calculate. The muscles must propel thousands of pounds of flesh through the freezing water. With the lungs collapsed, the whale relies entirely on the internal reservoirs of oxygen it stored at the surface. But even this vast supply must be rationed. As the darkness swallows the whale, its circulatory system initiates a radical lockdown. The heart rate slows to a crawl, sometimes beating only a few times a minute. The blood vessels leading to the skin, the digestive tract, and the extremities constrict tightly, completely cutting off the blood supply to any organ that is not immediately essential for survival. All the remaining oxygenated blood is shunted directly to the brain and the heart. The outer layers of the whale's body are effectively abandoned, left to endure the freezing cold and crushing pressure, while the vital core is kept alive. Now, descending through the 2,000-meter mark, the sperm whale has become a ghost, a massive, silent shadow gliding through a pitch-black universe where sight is entirely useless. In this profound darkness, eyes cannot find prey, but the whale is not blind. It is about to illuminate the abyss using one of the most sophisticated, powerful biological sonar systems ever engineered by the forces of nature. Taking up the vast majority of that enormous, rectangular head is a structure known as the spermaceti complex. It is a massive biological barrel, filled with hundreds of gallons of a specialized waxy oil. In the freezing depths, this oil crystallizes and hardens, changing its acoustic properties. At the very front of the whale's snout, air forced through specialized internal lips creates a sharp, incredibly loud click. This sound wave is fired backward, bouncing off a parabolic skull bone that acts like a satellite dish, before being channeled directly through the hardened spermaceti wax. The wax acts as an acoustic lens, focusing the sound into a tight, highly directional beam of sonic energy. The whale fires this beam out into the absolute blackness of the ocean. Click, click, click. These clicks are some of the loudest biological sounds on the planet, powerful enough to vibrate the water itself. The sound waves race out into the void, traveling for miles through the darkness. If they hit nothing, they fade into the abyss. But they strike an object, a rocky outcrop, a school of deep-sea fish, or the soft, gelatinous mantle of a giant squid. The sound waves shatter, reflecting back as echoes. These returning echoes are received not by the whale's ears, but by its lower jaw. The jawbone is filled with specialized fat that channels the returning sound directly into the inner ear and the brain. Instantly, the whale's mind processes the echoes, constructing a flawless, three-dimensional acoustic map of a world it cannot see. It knows exactly where the prey is, how large it is, how fast it is moving, and in what direction. The pace of the clicks begins to accelerate. The slow, rhythmic pulse turns into a rapid, frantic rhythm as the whale locks onto its target. This is the buzz, the final, acoustic countdown to an interception. Down here, the prey is not defenseless. The giant squid is a monster of the deep in its own right, a creature of pure muscle, armed with massive eyes that gather the faintest bioluminescence, and a crown of 10 tentacles lined with razor-sharp, serrated suckers. When the whale finally closes a distance, the encounter erupts into a violent, silent struggle in the pitch blackness. The The squid whips its tentacles around the whale's jaw, its serrated suckers tearing into the whale's thick skin, leaving the violent, circular scars that mark the bodies of every mature sperm whale. But the squid cannot win. The whale's jaw snaps shut, gripping the soft body of the cephalopod, crushing the life out of it before swallowing a whole. The hunt is over, but the dive is far from finished. The whale has been holding its breath for nearly an hour. Its oxygen stores are heavily depleted. Lactic acid is building up in its dark, myoglobin-rich muscles. The immense pressure is still trying to crush its folded rib cage. It is time to return to the world of light. The whale angles its massive head upward and begins a long, arduous climb toward the surface. This ascent is just as dangerous as the descent. As the animal rises, the crushing weight of the ocean begins to lift. The pressure decreases with every passing meter. Deep within the whale's chest, the physical laws reverse. The flexible rib cage slowly begins to expand outward. The lungs, flattened for the better part of an hour, begin to reinflate as the trapped air expands. Because the whale successfully kept the air isolated from its bloodstream during the dive, there is no dissolved nitrogen waiting to bubble up and destroy its tissues. The biological engineering holds true. The indigo hue of the twilight zone slowly gives way to the brighter, shifting blue of the sunlit shallows. The water warms. The heart rate, which had been reduced to a slow, steady drumbeat, begins to accelerate, pumping blood back into the oxygen-starved extremities. And then, with a sudden, violent break of the surface, the massive head breaches the waves. The blowhole opens. The exhausted air, heated by the whale's internal furnace and pressurized by the long ascent, blasts into the sky in a diagonal geyser of mist and vapor. The sound of the exhalation echoes across the empty ocean. Immediately, the whale draws in a massive, greedy breath of fresh, sunlit air, instantly refilling its lungs and sending a rush of oxygen flooding back into its depleted blood and muscles. It will rest here for a short time, riding the swells, gathering its strength, processing the oxygen it desperately needs. To an observer watching from a ship, the whale looks peaceful, a gentle giant basking in the sun. But beneath that scarred, weathered skin lies an anatomical fortress, a body that has learned to collapse without breaking, to see without light, and to carry the very air of the sky into the most hostile, crushing depths of the earth. It is a biological masterpiece built for extremes, existing in a perpetual cycle of descent and rebirth, ruling a vertical empire that remains forever out of reach for the rest of the air-breathing world. At the very edge of the world, where the northern latitudes surrender completely to the cold, the ocean ceases to behave like water. It becomes a grinding, tectonic landscape of shattered white and abyssal black. Here, along the drifting margins of the Arctic Sea ice, the soundscape is dominated by a slow, echoing violence. Massive flows of frozen ocean, millions of tons of ice, drift blindly across the polar basin, colliding and fracturing with groans that reverberate through the freezing air like distant artillery. The sun, when it bothers to rise at all during the long winter months, scrapes low along the horizon, offering a pale, heatless glare that does nothing to temper the absolute hostility of the environment. To exist here is to wage a perpetual war against thermodynamics. The water that sloshes through the jagged fissures in the ice hovers perpetually on the very brink of freezing. For any warm-blooded creature, to be submerged in this liquid is to invite a rapid, ruthless death. Water is an elemental thief. It conducts heat away from a living body over 20 times faster than air. To fall into the Arctic Ocean is to have your life force hemorrhaged into the void in a matter of minutes. The heart stutters, the nervous system misfires, and the organs shut down as the cold penetrates the core. Yet, draped across the jagged edges of these floating ice islands, resting with an air of complete indifference to the lethal cold, are mountains of living flesh. From a distance, a herd of walruses looks less like a gathering of animals and more like a geological formation. They are enormous, sluggish mounds of wrinkled brown and gray skin, piled atop one another in dense, breathing barricades. Adult males can weigh over 1.5 tons. Their massive skulls adorned with twin ivory tusks that curve downward like prehistoric ice axes. On land, or resting on the ice, they appear almost tragically clumsy. They heave their immense bulk forward with laborious effort, a picture of sluggish vulnerability. But this heavy, lethargic appearance is a grand biological deception. The walrus is not a victim of this brutal landscape. It is a thermal fortress, custom-built to conquer the very cold that should by all rights destroy it. When a walrus decides to feed, it drags its massive frame to the edge of the ice and slips beneath the dark surface of the water. The transition from the biting air to the freezing ocean is sudden, but the animal does not go into shock. Instead, the moment the walrus enters the water, its body executes one of the most drastic physiological defense mechanisms in the mammalian kingdom. It shuts down its own surface. In a typical mammal, blood is pumped constantly through the skin to nourish tissues and regulate temperature. But in the freezing depths of the Arctic, sending warm blood to the surface of the skin is suicidal. The ocean would instantly strip that heat away. The walrus solved this by employing a radical strategy known as peripheral vasoconstriction or blood shunting. Through a network of highly specialized muscles surrounding its blood vessels, the walrus forcefully clamps down on the arteries, leading to its skin and blubber. It completely cuts off the blood flow to its own exterior. The physical transformation is stark and immediate. If you were to watch a walrus submerge, you would see its color actually drain away. The mottled browns and pinks of its skin vanish, replaced by a ghostly, pallid white. The skin becomes cold to the touch, essentially taking on the exact temperature of the freezing ocean around it. Because the skin is now as cold as the water, no heat can be exchanged. The thermal theft of the ocean is neutralized. Beneath this frozen, bloodless armor of skin lies a layer of dense blubber that can be up to half a foot thick. And deep beneath that blubber, locked away in an impenetrable biological vault, the walrus's core remains burning hot. The heart, the lungs, the brain, and the digestive organs continue to operate at a comfortable 37 degrees Celsius, entirely isolated from the deadly cold pressing against the outside of the animal. It is a creature wearing its own frozen flesh as a spacesuit. Protected by this internal climate control, the walrus begins its descent. It abandons the faint light of the surface and dives deep into the benthic zone, plummeting toward the pitch-black seafloor. These dives can last for nearly half an hour, taking the animal into a realm of crushing pressure and total darkness. Down here, eyesight is completely useless. The seabed is a murky expanse of mud, sand, and drifting sediment. But the walrus does not need to see. Mounted on its blunt, flattened snout are hundreds of thick, stiff bristles known as vibrissae. These are not ordinary whiskers. They are a highly sophisticated, hypersensitive biological sonar array. Each individual bristle is packed with blood vessels and surrounded by a dense network of nerves, wired directly into a massive processing center in the animal's brain. As the walrus glides over the dark ocean floor, it sweeps its heavy head from side to side, dragging these vibrissae through the mud. It is feeling the seafloor with a resolution that rivals human eyesight. It can detect the microscopic contours of buried shells, the subtle displacement of water caused by a shifting clam, the faint textures of life hidden inches beneath the sand. When the vibrissae lock onto a target, usually a dense bed of bivalves, the walrus does not use its massive tusks to dig them out. Those ivory weapons are reserved for hauling its massive bulk onto the ice and for violent social combat. Instead, the walrus brings its highly specialized lips down against the mud. Forming a perfect airtight seal over the buried shell, the animal rapidly retracts its tongue, acting like a massive biological piston. This motion generates a vacuum of immense power. The suction is so violent that it literally rips the soft flesh of the clam straight out of its shell, leaving the hard casing buried in the mud, while the meat is sucked directly into the walrus's throat. A single adult walrus can vacuum up thousands of clams in a single feeding dive, churning up vast tracts of the seafloor in the process. This relentless foraging stirs up trapped nutrients, releasing them back into the water column, and acting as a vital engine for the entire Arctic ecosystem. All the while, moving through water that would kill a human in minutes, the walrus's internal furnace burns steadily, protected by the bloodless, freezing shield of its own skin. Eventually, lungs burning for oxygen, the leviathan angles its massive body upward and ascends toward a broken ceiling of ice. It breaches the surface, expelling a massive plume of breath into freezing air, and hooks its tusks over the edge of a floe. With a tremendous heave of muscle, it drags its ton-and-a-half bulk out of the water and back into the harsh Arctic air. And here, on the ice, the walrus faces a completely different, almost paradoxical threat. The same blubber and blood-shunting mechanism that saved its life in freezing water now becomes a lethal liability. Hauling out onto the ice requires a massive expenditure of muscular energy, and that energy generates internal heat. Furthermore, walruses are highly social creatures that pile together in dense, overlapping mounds to sleep. The combined body heat of dozens of massive mammals, insulated by thick blubber, creates a sudden, dangerous buildup of core temperature. In the middle of the frozen Arctic, the walrus is suddenly at risk of dying from heat stroke. But the biological engineering of this animal is perfectly reversible. The moment the walrus senses its internal temperature rising too high, the biological valves open. The muscles clamping the blood vessels relax. The heart pumps furiously, sending a massive surge of hot, oxygen-rich blood rushing outward from the core, pushing past the blubber and flooding directly into the skin. The ghostly white apparition that emerged from the ocean begins to transform. The skin flushes a deep, vibrant pink, sometimes turning almost blood red as the capillary beds dilate to their maximum capacity. The walrus is literally venting an internal furnace, radiating excess heat out into the freezing Arctic air. If you were to stand next to a herd of resting walruses, you could feel the heat radiating off their flushed bodies, turning the freezing air around them into a humid, localized microclimate. They lie there, these massive, blushing titans, grunting and shifting their weight, occasionally sparring with lazy sweeps of their tusks. They appear immovable, completely untroubled by the extreme forces swirling around them. A polar bear might stand on the periphery, watching the herd with hungry, calculating eyes. But even the apex predator of the ice knows better than to challenge a fully grown walrus. Their size, their dense skulls, and those lethal ivory daggers make them practically invulnerable anything but the shifting of the ice itself. The walrus is a creature defined by absolute extremes. It is a slow, lumbering beast on land that transforms into a graceful, vacuum-powered predator in the deep. It is an animal that wears the freezing cold as armor, manipulating the very flow of its own blood to turn its skin into a thermal shield, only to reverse the entire process minutes later to bleed heat into the polar wind. In a landscape that seeks to freeze the life out of everything that breathes, the walrus does not merely endure. It dictates its own terms, carrying its own impenetrable climate across the broken, grinding ice of the harshest ocean on Earth. Far from the sheltering embrace of coastlines, far from the jagged architecture of the coral reefs, the ocean strips away all complexity and leaves only a terrifying, unbroken void. Out here, the horizon is a razor-sharp line dividing two endless expanses of blue. The water is fathomless, hiding valleys and plains that have never felt the warmth of the sun. It is a desert of water, swept by invisible currents that travel for thousands of miles. To survive in this pelagic wilderness, an animal must either be fast enough to cross it or small enough to drift with it. But there is an exception, a creature that does not merely move through this endless expanse, but dominates it through the sheer, incomprehensible force of its own mass. A shadow begins to form in the deep blue, rising slowly from the depths. At first, it is just a darkening of the water, a shapeless eclipse moving toward the light. Then, the surface tension breaks. The water parts with a sound like tearing silk, and a monolith of mottled blue-gray flesh breaches the atmosphere. A pair of blowholes, large enough for a person to fall into, open wide. The exhalation is explosive, a deafening blast that fires a column of atomized water and hot breath 30 feet into the sky. The mist hangs in the air, catching the sunlight, before being carried away by the wind. And still, the back of the animal keeps emerging. It rolls through the waves in a seemingly endless procession of muscle and blubber. It is a living island, the blue whale. To look upon this creature is to witness a violation of scale. It is the heaviest animal to have ever existed in the known history of the universe. It dwarfs the most massive dinosaurs that ever shook the prehistoric Earth. Its tongue weighs as much as an adult elephant. Its heart, a massive, slow-beating engine of muscle, is the size of a small automobile, pumping hundreds of gallons of thick, dark blood through arteries so wide a human child could crawl through them. When you exist at this scale, the ordinary rules of biology begin to warp. Everything about the blue whale is an extreme adaptation to a life lived as a giant. But this unimaginable size comes with a terrifying hidden cost. Before we uncover the invisible war raging within the whale cells, we must first understand how an animal of this magnitude sustains the fires of its own metabolism. The blue whale is a predator, but it does not hunt with the calculated violence of a shark or the coordinated strategy of an orca. It hunts through sheer, overwhelming volume. During the polar summer, the 24-hour sunlight triggers an explosion of microscopic plant life, which in turn feeds astronomical swarms of krill, tiny, shrimp-like crustaceans barely the length of your little finger. These swarms can stretch for miles, turning the freezing water into a thick biological soup. The blue whale migrates thousands of miles across the globe to intercept this fleeting harvest. When the leviathan locates a swarm, it does not pick at the edges. It accelerates, its massive tail flukes driving it forward like a submarine. As it hits the densest part of the swarm, the whale performs a maneuver known as lunge feeding. Its lower jaw drops open to a near 90-degree angle. The skin along its throat and chest is deeply pleated, consisting of ventral grooves that stretch like an accordion. As the water rushes in, these pleats expand outward, billowing into a massive, cavernous pouch. In a single violent gulp, the blue whale engulfs a volume of water equal to its own massive body weight. It takes in millions of krill in a fraction of a second, but it cannot swallow the water. The whale's jaws snap shut, trapping the ocean inside. Then, using that elephant-sized tongue, it pushes upward, forcing the water out through hundreds of overlapping, fringe plates of baleen that hang from its upper jaw. The water escapes back into the sea, but the krill are trapped against the fibrous bristles. The whale swallows a concentrated mass of protein in one colossal gulp. It must repeat this exhausting, energy-draining lunge over and over again, consuming up to 4 tons of food every single day just to keep its massive heart beating. But the sheer mechanical effort feeding is nothing compared to the true existential threat that haunts the blue whale, a threat that does not come from the deep ocean, or from human hunters, or from starvation. It is a threat born from the very fabric of its own colossal existence. Every living organism on this planet is built from cells. You, a bird, a fish, a whale, we are all biological machines constructed from billions of microscopic, living units. To grow, to heal, to survive, these cells must constantly divide and replicate. They copy their DNA, split into two, and continue the cycle of life. But replication is never perfect. Every time a cell divides, there is a minuscule chance of an error, a mutation in the genetic code. Most of the time, these errors are harmless or the cell self-destructs. But sometimes the mutation is dark. Sometimes the error tells the cell to stop listening to the body. It tells the cell to grow wildly, to consume its neighbors, to replicate without end. We call this error cancer. Statistically, the risk of developing cancer is a game of biological roulette. The more cells you have, and the longer those cells live and divide, the higher the chance that one of them will mutate and turn against you. This is a fundamental law of biology. A human has roughly 37 trillion cells and lives for about 80 years. We face a significant risk of this genetic betrayal. Now look at the blue whale, a creature that can weigh up to 200 tons. A creature that possesses thousands of times more cells than a human and can live for nearly a century. With that astronomical number of cell divisions happening every single second of its long life, the blue whale should, by all statistical laws, be utterly riddled with tumors. It should not be able to reach maturity before its own biology turns toxic. Its sheer size should be a death sentence. And yet, it is not. Blue whales almost never get cancer. This baffling contradiction is known to science as Peto's paradox. How can the largest animal in the history of the Earth, built from an incomprehensible number of dividing cells, be nearly immune to the very disease that is statistically guaranteed to destroy it? The answer lies deep within the darkest, microscopic architecture of the whale's DNA. Evolution, over millions of years, recognized the fatal flaw of becoming a giant. To allow the blue whale to reach its titanic proportions, nature had to engineer a molecular defense system of unprecedented aggression and efficiency. Deep within the genetic code of the whale lies a specific gene known as P53. In human biology, P53 is often called the guardian of the genome. It is a molecular watchdog. Its entire purpose is to patrol the nucleus of the cell, scanning the DNA for errors. If P53 detects a mutation, a spark that could ignite into cancer, it instantly halts the cell's division. It orders emergency repairs. And if the damage is too severe to fix, P53 executes the ultimate protocol, apoptosis. It forces a mutated cell to commit suicide, destroying the threat before it can spread. In a human body, we have just one pair of these P53 genes. If those genes are damaged or silenced, our primary defense collapses and cancer runs wild. We are walking a genetic tightrope. But the blue whale does not rely on a single line of defense. When scientists peered into the genome of these oceanic titans, they found something astonishing. The whale has duplicated its tumor-suppressing genes. It doesn't just have one set of guardians. It has an entire army of them. Redundant copies of P53 and other critical repair genes are embedded throughout its DNA. Inside the body of the blue whale, a microscopic, relentless war is being waged every single second. As its trillions of cells divide to maintain its massive bulk, mutations inevitably occur. The sparks of cancer flare up in the darkness of its tissues. But before those corrupted cells can replicate, they are swarmed by a hypervigilant, heavily fortified network of genetic watchdogs. The mutations are flagged, isolated, and eradicated with ruthless precision. The whale's body is a fortress under constant internal siege, yet its defenses are so deeply entrenched, so incredibly over-engineered, that the threat is neutralized before it ever truly begins. This is the hidden miracle of the blue whale. Its survival is not just a triumph of scale, but a triumph of molecular engineering. It has hacked the fundamental rules of biology, effectively conquering one of the most persistent and deadly forces in nature, simply so it can exist, and the ocean desperately needs it to exist. The blue whale is not merely a resident of the pelagic void. It is the architect of it. When a blue whale consumes its daily tons of krill in the deep, freezing waters, it eventually returns to the sunlit surface to breathe and to rest. And here, it releases massive plumes of waste. This fecal matter is not just biological exhaust. It is a highly concentrated explosion of iron and nitrogen. In the open ocean, these nutrients are incredibly scarce. By bringing them up from the depths and releasing them at the surface, the whale acts as a colossal, living fertilizer pump. The iron triggers massive blooms of phytoplankton, microscopic plants that float in the sunlit zone. These phytoplankton form the absolute foundation of the entire marine food web. They feed the zooplankton, which feed the fish, which feed the seabirds, the sharks, and the whales themselves. Furthermore, these massive phytoplankton blooms draw down millions of tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, pumping out the very oxygen we breathe. The breath of the ocean itself is tied directly to the digestion of the blue whale. Even in death, the Leviathan provides. When a blue whale finally succumbs to old age, its massive heart slowing to a halt, its body does not simply vanish. It begins a slow, silent fall through the water column, descending into the crushing blackness of the abyssal plain. This event, known as a whale fall, delivers thousands of tons of concentrated protein and fat to a starved, alien environment. The carcass becomes a temporary oasis in the deep-sea desert. It will sustain entire communities of sleeper sharks, hagfish, bone-eating worms, and bizarre, undiscovered microbes for decades. Even in its absence, the monolith dictates the survival of millions. Out on the horizon, the great blue shadow rises once again. The blowhole shatters the surface, firing its geyser breath into the wind. The whale takes in the ocean air, its hyper-efficient lungs extracting every ounce of oxygen before it arches its massive spine. The small dorsal fin slices through the crest of a wave, followed by the sheer, staggering length of its tail stalk. Finally, the massive flukes, spanning 20 feet across, lift clear out of the water pouring from their edges like a waterfall, before slipping silently down into the blue. It leaves behind only a smooth, circular footprint on the surface of the restless sea. It is a creature that defies the odds of its own existence. A titan that wages a silent, victorious war against the decay of its own cells, moving through the deep as a living monument to the absolute, stubborn persistence of life. In the vast, uncaring void of the open ocean, the blue whale endures, a masterpiece of survival written in the language of giants. In the shallow coastal waters of the world's temperate and tropical seas, the ocean floor was a mask of absolute serenity. Sunlight filters down to the shifting surface, casting a hypnotic, rippling patchwork of light and shadow across a canvas of pale sand, swaying seagrass and scattered coral rubble. It is a world painted in vibrant, inviting colors, gently rocked by the rhythmic breathing of the tide. But this tranquil veneer is a spectacular illusion. Beneath this quiet, sun-dappled surface lies a biological theater of relentless, unforgiving violence. This is not the open ocean, where predators strike from the infinite blue. This is a crowded, claustrophobic battlefield of the shallows. Every single square inch of this landscape is fiercely contested real estate. Grazers, scavengers, opportunists, and heavily armored hunters patrol the sediment in a state of constant, desperate hunger. Here, physical damage is not a rare, catastrophic event. It is an everyday certainty. Crabs wield claws capable of crushing bone and shell. Fish dart from the shadows to tear away soft flesh. Octopuses probe the crevices with quiet, lethal efficiency, pulling victims apart piece by piece. And when the storms roll in, the very ocean itself weaponizes the seabed, churning the sand and hurling bodies against razor-sharp reefs. In the vast majority of the animal kingdom, catastrophic physical trauma writes a very short, very final chapter. If a vertebrate loses a major limb, the result is massive hemorrhage, systemic shock, and rapid death. At best, it is a permanent, crippling loss that virtually guarantees the animal will soon fall prey to something else. But scattered across this treacherous, contested seabed are creatures that do not play by the standard rules of biology. Animals that view the catastrophic destruction of their own bodies not as a violent end, but as a bizarre, miraculous beginning. Resting quietly against the pale sand, appearing almost entirely defenseless, is the starfish. At first glance, it looks more like a decorative ornament than a living, breathing creature. Its soft, textured body spreads outward from a central disc into 5 distinct arms, forming a symmetrical, almost geometric shape that glows in vivid shades of ochre, crimson, and deep violet against the blue water. Beneath those arms, hundreds of tiny, translucent, tube-like feet ripple in slow, mesmerizing waves. These feet are driven by a complex, internal hydraulic engine known as a water vascular system, pumping seawater through biological pipes to create suction and movement. It glides across the sediment with a slow, patient, almost mechanical determination. It does not look formidable. It has no jaws, no venom, no hardened exoskeleton, and no ability to flee. But beneath this simple, colorful exterior lies a body plan so radically alien, so fundamentally divorced from the architecture of most animals, that it allows for feats of survival that border on the supernatural. To understand the starfish, we must first abandon everything we understand about how a body is supposed to work. The starfish is an echinoderm, a lineage of marine life that completely discard the concept of a centralized command center. It has no brain. It has no heart. It possesses no internal skeleton of bone. It lacks the compact, vulnerable cluster of vital organs that define a mammal or a fish. Instead, the starfish is a masterpiece of biological decentralization. Its nervous system is not a centralized computer, but a distributed network. A simple, circular nerve ring surrounds its mouth at the very center of its body. From this ring, radial nerves branch out, traveling straight down the center of every single arm. It does not concentrate its awareness in a head. Instead, it spreads its processing power, its sensory perception, and its physical control evenly across its entire form. Every single limb contains the neural circuitry required to taste the water, feel the terrain, coordinate the hundreds of hydraulic tube feet, and respond to the environment. The starfish does not operate as a single, top-down organism. It operates as a biological collective, a mind spread evenly through flesh. This distributed, network-like architecture is the secret to an evolutionary magic trick that activates only when disaster strikes. Imagine the scene on the reef. The starfish is slowly inching its way over a jagged piece of coral, its 2 feet probing the microscopic valleys of the rock for chemical traces of food. Suddenly, the shadow of a predator falls over it. A large triggerfish, armed with heavy, crushing jaws, descends. The fish locks its teeth onto one of the starfish's arms and pulls violently. The starfish grips the rock, its hydraulic feet anchoring it to the stone. The tension builds until, with a violent tear of tissue and nerve, the arm is completely severed from the central disc. The predator swims away with its prize, leaving the starfish severely maimed, an open wound bleeding vital fluids into seawater. For a vertebrate, this is the onset of death. For the starfish, it is merely a mechanical failure, and the biological repair sequence begins almost before the predator has vanished from sight. The animal does not go into shock. Instead, specialized cells surrounding the catastrophic wound immediately rush to seal the exposed tissue. They form a biological tourniquet, locking out the bacteria-rich seawater, preventing infection, and instantly halting the loss of internal fluids. The water vascular system, the hydraulic network that drives the animal, dynamically recalculates the internal pressure, sealing off the severed pipes so that the remaining 4 arms can continue to function without a drop in performance. The starfish is critically injured, but it is entirely stable. And then, deep within the tissues at the site of the amputation, a process begins that has fascinated and baffled cellular biologists for decades. In a typical animal, once a cell is assigned a job, say, becoming a muscle cell or a nerve cell or a skin cell, its fate is sealed. It specializes, and it cannot change its mind. But the cells near the wound of the starfish possess a terrifyingly powerful ability known as dedifferentiation. They undergo a process of biological amnesia. The specialized cells at the edge of the tear actually revert back in time. They shed their specific roles, dissolving their rigid identities to become a pool of primitive, highly adaptable, blank slate stem cells. The starfish literally breaks down its own adult tissue to create the raw, biological clay needed for reconstruction. Over the next few days, a small, pale swelling forms over the scarred wound. It looks insignificant, like a small blister of soft tissue. But beneath the surface of that tiny mound, a staggeringly complex orchestration of genetic commands is taking place. Deep-seated genes, the exact same genes that guided the animal's growth when it was nothing more than a microscopic embryo, suddenly reactivate. They begin to replay the original blueprint of the starfish's creation. Slowly, deliberately, the swelling begins to elongate. Out of the biological clay, new muscles weave themselves together. Connective tissues align in perfect geometric patterns. The radial nerve, severed so violently by the predator, begins to grow outward, establishing a brand new communication line with the central ring. The tiny limb grows longer, generating hundreds of new microscopic tube feet, new sensory organs, and new digestive extensions. Weeks pass, and the arm regains its full length, its full color, and its full functional power. The animal is completely, flawlessly whole again. It is an astonishing display of tissue engineering. But this is not the limit of the starfish's capability. What makes this animal truly alien is the realization that this process of miraculous regeneration can actually run in reverse. Let us return to the moment of the attack. The predator tears the arm away, but perhaps it is startled by a larger shadow and drops the severed limb on the sandy seabed. The main body of the starfish crawls away to heal, but what of the discarded arm? It is a severed fragment of flesh, completely disconnected from the stomach, the mouth, and the central nerve ring. It is, by all biological definitions, dead meat. But if that severed arm happens to contain just a small sliver of the starfish's central disc, just a fraction of that circular nerve ring, the fragment refuses to die. Lying alone on the ocean floor, the severed arm activates the exact same regenerative machinery. The wound seals. The cells dedifferentiate. The embryonic genes roar back to life. But this time, the arm is not trying to grow a new limb. It is trying to grow an entire body. From the jagged, torn edge of the base, a new central disc begins to form. The severed radial nerve within the solitary arm acts as a foundation, expanding and branching out to build a brand new nerve ring. As the weeks turn into months, for tiny, perfectly formed new arms erupt from the base of the severed fragment. They grow outward, sprouting tube feet and sensory organs, until the solitary, dying arm is completely reconstructed a brand new, fully functional starfish. This phenomenon is known as fission. It is a reproductive strategy born out of absolute devastation. The starfish does not just survive destruction, it exploits it. It turns a violent act of a predator into a mechanism for its own multiplication. Every single arm of a starfish is essentially a compressed biological seed, a multi-core organism waiting for the violent opportunity to become a whole new entity. The predator thought it was eating a meal. Instead, it inadvertently acted as a gardener, taking a cutting from a plant and inadvertently propagating the species. From an ecological standpoint, this borderline immortal resilience completely changes how the starfish interacts with its environment. In the violent world of the reef, most animals live in a state of perpetual fear. They prioritize safety, hiding in crevices, heavily armored, fleeing at the first sign of danger, because they know that to be injured is to die. The starfish has no such fear, because injury is merely a temporary inconvenience. The starfish operates as a slow-moving, absolute terror of the seabed. It does not need to flee, and so it takes risks that other predators would never dare. It is a ruthless hunter of heavily armored prey. When a starfish encounters a tightly sealed clam or mussel, an animal locked within a calcium carbonate fortress that can withstand the crushing jaws of fish and crabs, the starfish simply drapes itself over the shell. It attaches hundreds of its hydraulic tube feet to the two halves of the bivalve, and then it begins to pull. The clam fights back, locking its powerful adductor muscles to keep the shell shut. But the starfish does not rely on sudden, explosive muscle power. It relies on the relentless, untiring mechanics of its water vascular system. It pulls steadily, continuously, for hours if necessary, until the clam's muscles eventually fatigue and twitch. The shell opens, but only by a fraction of a millimeter, just a microscopic crack. For the starfish, that is all the space it needs. Because it has no jaws to reach inside, the starfish performs a maneuver of pure biological horror. It literally pushes its own stomach out of its mouth. The translucent, acidic organ extrudes from the starfish's body, slipping through the microscopic crack in the clam shell and inflating directly inside the victim's living room. The stomach secretes powerful digestive enzymes, dissolving the clam alive within its own impenetrable fortress. Once the victim has been reduced to a nutrient-rich soup, the starfish absorbs the liquid, retracts its stomach back into its own body, and glides slowly away, leaving behind a perfectly clean, entirely unbroken shell. This incredibly bold feeding strategy frequently leaves the starfish vulnerable to attack. Its soft arms are exposed as it wrestles with prey, but it simply does not care. If a crab approaches and snips off the tip of an arm while the starfish is feeding, the starfish will continue to digest its meal, completely unbothered by the loss of a limb. It knows that the lost flesh will return. It knows that its populations will remain perfectly stable, regardless of how heavily the local predators harvest their arms. This fearless resilience allows starfish to act as foundational regulators of the entire marine ecosystem. Because they can hunt with impunity, they keep populations of mussels, barnacles, and sea urchins in check. Without the slow, unstoppable, regenerating presence of the starfish, these fast-growing invertebrates will explode in number, completely overrunning the reefs, monopolizing the physical space, and suffocating the coral. The entire diversity of the coastal biome depends heavily on a predator that simply refuses to let physical destruction stop its slow, methodical march across the seabed. To human observers, peering down from the dry world above, the starfish remains a symbol of quiet, geometric beauty, a colorful, stationary star resting peacefully in a tidal pool. But down in the cold, unforgiving reality of the marine battlefield, it represents something far more profound. It is a creature that has completely bypassed the evolutionary arms race of speed, shell, and bone. It did not invest its energy in learning how to avoid the violent reality of the ocean. Instead, it learned how to endure it. It took the most terrifying consequence of life, the catastrophic dismemberment of the physical body, and rewrote the biological code, turning the ultimate failure into an engine of rebirth. As the tide shifts, dragging heavy currents across the sand, a starfish continues its slow, hydraulic crawl toward the shadow of a reef. It is missing two of its limbs, the stumps pale and sealed, already swelling with the microscopic promise of new flesh. Somewhere behind it, drifting in the dark, cold currents of the seafloor, one of those severed arms is slowly, quietly reorganizing its own cellular structure, building a mouth, weaving a nerve ring, preparing to pull itself out of the sand as an entirely new life. In a relentless, bruising contest for survival beneath the waves, The starfish stands as a master of biological persistence, an animal that proves that sometimes the most unstoppable force in nature is the one that simply refuses to stay broken. In the sun-drenched shallows of the tropical coast, a vast underwater prairie sways to the slow, rhythmic breathing of the tide. This is a seagrass meadow, a sprawling labyrinth of emerald ribbons bathed in shifting shafts of turquoise light. From above, it looks entirely peaceful. Tiny, iridescent fish dart through the canopy like sparks carried on a gentle breeze, and microscopic plankton drift aimlessly in the warm currents. Everything in this environment appears delicate, soft, and infinitely fragile, bending and bowing to the whims of the ocean's movement. But this illusion of tranquility masks a highly dynamic, physically punishing world. The coastal shallows are at the absolute mercy of the elements. When the weather turns, these serene meadows are ripped by violent storm surges. Heavy debris is violently tossed through the water column, and the very plants that provide shelter are whipped back and forth with terrifying force. To survive here, a fish must be hydrodynamic, powerful, and capable of fleeing at a moment's notice. It must be built to slice through the turbulence, outrun the predators that patrol the meadow's edge, and escape the crushing weight of the shifting sea. And yet, clinging to a single blade of seagrass, perfectly still amidst the swirling currents, is an animal that violates every single one of these survival rules. It is a creature that seems to have been assembled by an eccentric artist rather than forged by the brutal pragmatism of evolution. It does not possess a sleek, torpedo-shaped body. It has no scales to smooth its passage through the water. It cannot swim with sudden, explosive bursts of speed. In fact, it swims upright, hovering vertically in the water column like a tiny, aquatic centaur, its head angled forward like a grazing horse. It is propelled only by the frantic, nearly invisible fluttering of tiny, translucent fins on its back and sides. It moves with agonizing slowness, a creature completely incapable of outrunning anything. This is the seahorse. By all conventional logic of marine biology, it should not exist. It looks absurdly vulnerable, an evolutionary mistake just waiting to be devoured or crushed by the relentless forces of the coast. But the seahorse is not a mistake. It is an armored anomaly, and the secret to its survival lies locked within the extraordinary, almost mechanical architecture of its tail. When you observe a seahorse, the tail immediately draws the eye. It is curled tightly inward, gripping the seagrass stem like a coiled hook. At first glance, this appendage looks simple, delicate, and entirely unassuming, just a biological tether to keep the poor swimmer from being swept out to sea. But if you were to strip away the skin and examine the skeleton beneath, you would not find the anatomy of a fish. You would find the blueprints for an advanced, crush-resistant robotic arm. To understand the genius of the seahorse, we must first look at the rest of the vertebrate world. In almost every other animal with a tail, from monkeys to dogs to lizards to sharks, the tail is built on a cylindrical blueprint. The bones form a round column, surrounded by soft tissues and muscle. A round cylinder is excellent at bending, and it distributes pressure evenly across its smooth surface. But the cylinder has a fatal mechanical flaw. When an overwhelming, crushing force is applied to a round structure, it cannot absorb the energy. It resists the pressure until it reaches its breaking point, and then it fails catastrophically. The bone snaps, the spinal cord is severed, and the structure is permanently destroyed. The seahorse, recognizing that it cannot outswim danger, completely abandoned the cylinder. Instead, it evolved a tail built out of squares. If you were to cut a cross-section of a seahorse's tail, it would not be a circle. It forms a distinct, four-sided square, constructed from interlocking bony plates. This seemingly minor shift in geometric design radically transforms the physics of the animal's body. It elevates the seahorse from a fragile fish to a masterclass in structural engineering. These square, bony plates are arranged in rigid, box-like segments that run the entire length of the tail. Connecting these segments are highly flexible, hinge-like joints. When a massive, external pressure is applied to this square tail, whether from the crushing bite of a predator or the violent impact of storm debris, the structure does not shatter. Instead, the interlocking plates do something entirely unexpected. They slide. Because of the square geometry, the force is not concentrated on a single brittle point. The pressure is instantly redistributed along the flat edges and corners of the box-like segments. The bony plates shear slightly against one another, sliding just enough to absorb the devastating energy of the impact. The tail compresses, flattening out under pressure, physically deforming without breaking. Laboratory tests on seahorse biology have revealed a staggering reality. The tail of a seahorse can be violently crushed in nearly half of its original width, and the animal will survive unharmed. The interlocking armor takes the brunt of the assault, shifting and bending, while the delicate spinal cord running precisely through the dead center of the square remains completely untouched. Once the pressure is released, the plates slide back into place, and the tail regains its original shape. It is a biological shock absorber of unparalleled efficiency. This mechanical resilience is the absolute cornerstone of the seahorse's existence. Because it is such a laughably slow swimmer, the seahorse's primary defense mechanism is to simply hide in plain sight. Its skin is a masterful canvas of camouflage, shifting in color and growing fleshy appendages to perfectly mimic the surrounding algae and seagrass. It anchors itself to the stem, locks its square tail into place, and waits. When a predator approaches, a hungry snapper, a grouper, or a sharp-eyed wrasse, the seahorse does not panic. It does not release its grip and try to flee, because it knows it would lose that race in seconds. Instead, it presses its body tightly against the vegetation, aligning its silhouette with the swaying grass, and tightens its anchor. It trusts entirely in its invisibility. But camouflage is never perfect. If the predator spots the seahorse and lunges, snapping its powerful jaws shut over the animal's lower body, the sheer genius of the square tail is activated. The predator bites down, expecting the satisfying crunch of fragile fish bones. Instead, it bites into a yielding, sliding puzzle of armor plates. The tail compresses, absorbing the crushing force of the jaws, completely protecting the vital nerves inside. Furthermore, the square edges of the tail lock fiercely around the seagrass stem, making the seahorse incredibly difficult to pry loose. The predator might succeed in tearing the seagrass completely out of the seabed, but the seahorse will remain locked to the broken stem, its body bruised but completely intact, drifting away to settle somewhere new. This astonishing geometric armor does not just provide defense, it also grants the seahorse a terrifying level of predatory dexterity. Because while it may be heavily armored, the seahorse is still a hunter. It feeds on tiny, fast-moving crustaceans that drift through the water column. To catch them, the seahorse requires absolute stability. The square segments of its tail operate exactly like the joints of a highly articulated industrial robot. The tail can twist, coil, and contort with pinpoint precision, wrapping around incredibly narrow stems or irregularly shaped coral branches. This allows the seahorse to position its body with the mathematical accuracy of a sniper. It waits, perfectly still, its eyes moving independently to scan the water. When a tiny shrimp drifts within a few millimeters of its elongated snout, the seahorse unleashes the only fast movement its body is capable of. Powerful muscles at the back of its head contract violently, snapping the snout upward in a fraction of a millisecond. This hyper-fast movement expands the volume inside the seahorse's mouth, creating a sudden, massive void of pressure. The water in front of the snout literally tears open, creating a micro-vacuum that instantly sucks the unsuspecting shrimp directly into the seahorse's gullet. There is no chewing, no struggle. The prey simply vanishes. The strike is so fast that it is virtually invisible to the naked eye. And then, the seahorse settles back into its motionless vigil, heavily armored, perfectly anchored, waiting for the next meal to drip by. From an evolutionary standpoint, the seahorse represents a bizarre and beautiful compromise. It belongs to a family of long-bodied fishes known as the cyngathids, which includes the equally strange pipefish and sea dragons. Millions of years ago, as the ancestors of the seahorse began to adopt a completely vertical, ambush-hunting lifestyle, they needed a way to anchor themselves in the chaotic coastal currents. Natural selection began a slow, relentless redesign of their anatomy. The round, swimming tail gradually flattened, the bones fused into plates, and the corners sharpened into squares. The seahorse sacrificed the ability to swim fast, trading the sleekness of a typical fish for the unyielding durability of a living fortress. Today, This square-tailed architecture is so flawlessly efficient that human engineers are actively studying it. Material scientists and roboticists look to the seahorse when trying to design flexible, crush-resistant tools for medicine and deep-sea exploration. They are trying to replicate the sliding, interlocking plates that allow a structure to be severely crushed without destroying the fragile wires or cameras hidden inside. Yet, the seahorse knows nothing of human engineering. It simply exists, swaying gently in the turquoise light of the shallows. The ocean around it is a theater of perpetual motion and violence. Storm surges will eventually roll in, turning the clear water into a dark, churning washing machine of sand and debris. Predators will continuously patrol the margins of the meadow, looking for anything soft enough to kill. But when the currents rip through the seagrass, the seahorse will not run. It will calmly curl its tail around a sturdy blade. The bony squares will lock into place. The interlocking plates will prepare to slide, to compress, and to endure. In a marine world that constantly demands speed and aggression, the seahorse answers with stillness and geometry. It is a creature that survives not by fighting the immense power of the sea, but by wearing an armor so mathematically perfect that the ocean itself cannot break it. Along the sweeping, sunlit slopes of the tropical coral reef, where the vibrant architecture of limestone towers gives way to the vast, open plains of the sandy seabed, the ocean floor is a theater of perpetual hunger. Down here in the benthic zone, there is no such thing as a safe open space. The sand is heavily patrolled. Predatory fish glide just inches above the bottom, their eyes sweeping the sediment for the slightest twitch of life. Heavy clawed crabs march across the rubble, overturning stones to uncover whatever is hiding beneath. It is an ecosystem that demands defense. To survive in plain sight, an animal must be heavily armored, highly venomous, or blisteringly fast. Yet, lying completely exposed on the bright white sand is an organism that possesses absolutely none of these traits. It looks like a discarded piece of thick, leathery debris, a sluggish, elongated cylinder, blunt at both ends, covered in fleshy bumps and moving at a pace so agonizingly slow it barely registers as motion at all. It does not have a hard shell. It possesses no teeth. It has no stingers, no venomous spines, and it is entirely incapable of swimming away from danger. To any passing predator, it appears to be nothing more than defenseless, protein-rich meal simply waiting to be eaten. This is the sea cucumber, and its harmless, almost pathetic appearance is one of the most brilliant deceptions in the natural world. Because the sea cucumber does not survive by fighting, and it does not survive by fleeing. It survives by performing a feat of biological alchemy so extreme that it borders on science fiction. When faced with the threat of death, the sea cucumber has a terrifying ability to intentionally dissolve its own physical form, shifting the very state of its flesh from solid to liquid and back to solid again. To comprehend this superpower, we have to look past its uninspiring exterior and examine the deep evolutionary lineage of the animal. The sea cucumber is an echinoderm. It is a close relative of the heavily armored sea urchin and the regenerating starfish. But while its cousins invested millions of years of evolution into growing rigid calcium carbonate spines and thick, bony plates, the sea cucumber went in the absolute opposite direction. It abandoned the armor entirely. It abandoned the very concept of a fixed physical structure. The secret to this creature's survival lies woven into the microscopic fabric of its skin and body wall. In almost every other animal on Earth, the structural integrity of the body is dictated by connective tissue, the tendons, ligaments, and cartilage that hold everything together. This tissue is made primarily of collagen. In a human being or a fish or a crab, the mechanical properties of collagen are permanently fixed. Our ligaments have a set amount of elasticity. Our cartilage has a set amount of firmness. We are trapped by the physical limits of our own biological scaffolding. But the sea cucumber is not trapped. It possesses a radically different, highly specialized form of connective tissue known to science as mutable collagenous tissue, or catch collagen. This tissue is not a passive biological building material. It is a highly dynamic, neurologically controlled matrix. Embedded within the sea cucumber's flesh are millions of microscopic collagen fibers, bound together by complex chemical crosslinks. When the animal is simply resting or slowly crawling across the sand, specialized cells secrete proteins that lock these crosslinks tightly together. The collagen fibers bind to one another with incredible friction. In this resting state, the sea cucumber's body is surprisingly firm, possessing the rigid, tough consistency of thick cartilage or heavy rubber. It holds its shape, allowing its rows of tiny tube feet to grip the sand and propel it forward. But then, the shadow of a predator falls across the seabed. A large, hungry triggerfish spots the exposed animal and dives. It's heavy. Crushing jaws open to take a massive bite out of the slow-moving target. The sea cucumber cannot run, but it senses the approaching threat through subtle shifts in water pressure and vibrations in the sand. Instantly, its decentralized nervous system fires a frantic signal directly into the tissues of its body wall. What happens next is an act of rapid, intentional biological disintegration. Different specialized cells within the tissue instantly flood the body wall with a completely different set of proteins, chemical agents designed to sever bonds holding the collagen fibers together. In a fraction of a second, the microscopic friction drops to zero. The rigid crosslinks dissolve. The tough, rubbery scaffolding of the animal's body simply lets go. Before the predator's jaws can snap shut, the sea cucumber loses its structural integrity. It ceases to be a solid object. Its flesh becomes completely flaccid, adopting the pliability of soft, flowing syrup. Under the threat of attack, the sea cucumber throws its newly liquefied body toward the nearest jagged outcrop of coral rock. It does not crawl, it pours itself. The animal elongates and flattens, its body warping and bending with fluid dynamics as it hits the limestone. It squeezes into a microscopic fissure in the rock, a crack so narrow, so impossibly tight, that no solid animal of its volume could ever hope to fit inside. The sea cucumber flows into the dark crevices of the reef like water draining into the earth, conforming perfectly to the jagged, razor-sharp contours of the stone. The predator lunges, but its jaws snap shut on empty water. The prey has vanished into the rock. But the magic of catch collagen is not merely the ability to turn to liquid. If the sea cucumber remains soft, the predator could simply insert a long snout or a narrow claw into the crack and pull the helpless, gelatinous mass back out into the open. The sea cucumber knows this, and so, the moment it is safely wedged deep within the labyrinth of the coral rock, the neurological signal reverses. The softening chemicals are flushed away. The binding proteins are flooded back into the tissue. The microscopic collagen fibers instantly lock back together. In the blink of an eye, the liquid flesh turns back into stone. The sea cucumber solidifies, its body now cast perfectly into the exact, irregular shape of the hiding place. It swells slightly, wedging itself against the walls of crevice with immense, unyielding pressure. It becomes a rigid, immovable plug of living tissue, cemented completely into the architecture of the reef. If a predator were to grab hold of the animal now, it would find it impossible to dislodge. The sea cucumber would rather be torn in half than pulled from its sanctuary. It has literally become part of the rock. It will remain locked in this rigid, defensive state for hours, completely invisible and totally inaccessible, waiting with infinite patience for the danger to pass. When the seabed is quiet once again, the chemical bonds will silently dissolve. The body will soften. The animal will pour itself back out onto the sand, re-solidify into its standard cylindrical shape, and resume its slow, endless patrol of the ocean floor. This breathtaking ability to phase shift between solid and liquid does more than just keep the sea cucumber alive. It fundamentally dictates its profound ecological role. The sea cucumber is the great purifier of the ocean floor. It is a deposit feeder, a biological vacuum cleaner that processes the endless rain of organic detritus that falls from the reef above. Dead algae, decaying matter, and microscopic waste constantly blanket the seabed. If left unchecked, this decaying material would suffocate the sand, encouraging the growth of toxic bacteria and stripping oxygen from the water, ultimately killing the reef from the bottom up. But the sea cucumber prevents this collapse. As it drags its rigid body across the dunes, it extends a crown of feathery, sticky tentacles from its mouth. These tentacles methodically sweep the sand, grabbing massive clumps of sediment and stuffing them continuously into the animal's digestive tract. Inside, its highly acidic stomach breaks down the organic waste, stripping away the nutrients and the decaying matter. What comes out the other end is nothing but pure, clean, oxygenated sand. A single sea cucumber can filter and purify dozens of pounds of sediment every single year. A healthy population of them acts as a massive automated filtration system, constantly turning over the seabed, recycling nutrients, and ensuring that the reef remains a vibrant, habitable environment. And its mutable collagen is critical to this exhausting work. The seabed is not perfectly flat. It is a chaotic, uneven terrain of rolling dunes, jagged shells, and tangled roots. As the sea cucumber feeds, its body must constantly adapt to the shifting ground beneath it. By constantly tweaking the firmness of its flesh, softening slightly to drape over a rock, then stiffen to push through a heavy mound of sand, the animal maintains perfect traction and balance. It is in a state of constant, subtle physical transformation, adjusting its mechanical properties second by second to match the physical demands of its environment. In the crushing, pitch-black pressures of the deep abyssal plains, thousands of meters below the reef, other species of sea cucumbers take this adaptation to even greater extremes. Down there, where the mud is so soft it is practically liquid, sea cucumbers use their catch collagen to become almost entirely gelatinous, spreading their weight perfectly so they do not sink into the abyss. Some have even adapted to swim, softening their bodies into thin, translucent ribbons that undulate to the dark water like ghosts before landing and solidifying on the mud to feed. The profound mechanical genius of the sea cucumber has not gone unnoticed by the human world. Today, in advanced laboratories, material scientists, bioengineers, and roboticists obsessively study the chemical pathways of catch collagen. They are attempting to crack the code of this mutable tissue, hoping to design a new generation of synthetic materials, smart plastics, adaptive armor, and soft robotics that can instantly switch from rigid scaffolding to flexible, flowing liquid with the simple application of chemical or electrical current. The medical applications for self-stiffening casts or adaptive surgical tools are staggering. Yet, the sea cucumber requires no laboratory. It has perfected this technology over hundreds of millions of years in the unforgiving crucible of the ocean floor. As the tropical sun beats down on the blue water, casting rippling nets of light across the sand, the sea cucumber continues its slow, methodical harvest of the sediment. A crab scuttles past, its heavy claws clicking against the rubble. A shadow sweeps overhead as a ray glides effortlessly on the current. The sea cucumber pays them no mind. It looks soft. It looks slow. It looks like a creature that evolution simply forgot to arm. But beneath that leathery exterior lies a mastery of physics that defies comprehension. It is a creature that recognizes a fundamental truth of survival. Sometimes armor can be cracked. Sometimes speed can be outmatched. But if you have the power to surrender your very shape, to let go of your form, and become fluid in the face of absolute destruction, you become invincible. In a violent, rigid world, the sea cucumber survives by becoming the ultimate master of transformation, an animal that conquers the ocean not by fighting it, but by melting away into the spaces where death cannot follow. In the warm, crystalline shallows of tropical coral lagoon, the underwater landscape operates at a frantic, almost kinetic pace. Coral heads rise from the pale, sandy floor like the intricate spires of ancient, submerged fortresses. Shafts of pure sunlight pierce the surface, fracturing into thousands of dancing beams that illuminate a world entirely obsessed with the brutal mathematics of survival. Here, life is a constant, high-stakes negotiation between the hungry and the hunted. Schools of silver baitfish move in perfect, liquid synchronization, flashing and changing direction a fraction of a second to evade the dark, torpedo-like silhouettes of predatory jacks and barracudas passing overhead. Eels dart from shadow crevices. Crabs scuttle backward with raised, defensive claws. In this labyrinth of limestone and living tissue, the rules of existence are ruthlessly simple. You must be heavily armored, perfectly camouflaged, or blisteringly fast. Yet, drifting through this theater of high-speed violence, completely ignoring the frantic pace of the reef around it, is a creature that seems to break every logical rule of marine survival. It does not possess the sleek, hydrodynamic profile of a hunter. It is rounded, soft, and bulbous, its body tapering awkwardly toward a disproportionately small tail. It lacks the broad, powerful fins required for explosive acceleration. Instead, it propels itself with a rapid, almost comical fluttering of its tiny pectoral and dorsal fins, hovering above the coral rubble like an aquatic bumblebee. It moves with a slow, deliberate curiosity, its large, independently swiveling eyes inspecting the reef with an air of complete unconcern. To a passing predator, this animal looks like a biological mistake. It is the pufferfish. It appears entirely vulnerable, a slow-moving, fleshy target completely stripped of the standard armaments of the ocean. It cannot outswim danger. It has no heavy scales to deflect a bite, and its bright, patterned skin often makes it highly visible against the muted colors of the reef. But this comical, clumsy appearance is a lethal deception. The pufferfish does not need speed. It does not need armor, because hidden deep within the soft tissues of his body is a chemical weapon of such staggering, terrifying potency that it challenges the very limits of biological warfare. The pufferfish is a living, breathing reservoir for a compound known as tetrodotoxin. To understand the absolute dominance of the pufferfish, one must first understand the chilling mechanics of this chemical. Tetrodotoxin, or TTX, is a neurotoxin. It does not kill by causing physical trauma, massive internal bleeding, or tissue necrosis. It operates on a microscopic, almost invisible level, executing a flawless, targeted strike against the fundamental electrical wiring of the vertebrate body. Every thought, every heartbeat, every twitch of a muscle in an animal's body relies on electrical signals racing along nerve fibers. These electrical impulses are generated by the rapid flow of charged particles, specifically sodium ions, moving in and out of the cell membrane through specialized protein gates called sodium channels. When a brain commands a muscle to move, these microscopic gates fly open, sodium rushes in, and the electrical signal leaps forward. Tetrodotoxin is a molecule perfectly shaped by nature to find those sodium channels and completely jam them shut. It binds to the outside of the channel pore with absolute unbreakable precision, acting like a broken key jammed permanently into a lock. The gates cannot open. The sodium cannot flow. In an instant, the electrical communication network of the entire body goes completely dark. For a predator that makes a fatal mistake of swallowing a pufferfish, the consequences are immediate and horrifying. As the toxin enters the bloodstream, it sweeps through the nervous system. The muscles go entirely limp. The fins cease to paddle. The jaw locks. The paralysis spreads with terrifying speed, sweeping from the extremities inward until it reaches the diaphragm and the muscles responsible for drawing water over the gills. Breathing stops. The victim is locked in a state of absolute, total paralysis, completely incapable of moving a single muscle, yet often remaining entirely conscious as the oxygen slowly drains from its blood. The concentration of tetrodotoxin found in the liver, the reproductive organs, and even the skin of a single pufferfish is enough to kill dozens of adult humans. It is one of the most deadly naturally occurring substances on planet Earth, up to 1,200 times more toxic than cyanide. But this raises a profound, almost impossible biological paradox. The pufferfish is a vertebrate. It has a brain. It has a heart. It has a complex nervous system built on the exact same foundation of electrical impulses and sodium channels as the predators it kills. Its own tissues are absolutely saturated with this world-ending poison. So why is the pufferfish not paralyzed? How can a creature pump a lethal neurotoxin through its own veins, store in its own organs, and secrete it from its own skin without instantly suffering the same horrifying death as its victims? The answer lies in an evolutionary masterstroke buried incredibly deep within the animal's genetic code. Over millions of years, as the ancestors of the modern pufferfish began to encounter this toxin, natural selection initiated a microscopic redesign. Deep within the DNA of the pufferfish, a spontaneous, tiny mutation occurred in the gene responsible for building its sodium channels. It was a change in just a single amino acid in the massive, complex structure of the protein gate. But that microscopic shift was everything. That single altered building block subtly changed the physical shape of the sodium channel's outer pore. It warped the keyhole. Because of this tiny architectural modification, the tetrodotoxin molecule can no longer find a grip. The deadly chemical key floats directly past the lock, entirely unable to bind to the nerve cells. The pufferfish's electrical signals fire flawlessly. Its muscles contract, its heart beats, and its brain processes the world with absolute clarity, completely untouched by the lethal soup of neurotoxins saturating its own body. Evolution has essentially granted the pufferfish the ultimate biological immunity, allowing it to wield a weapon of mass destruction, while remaining entirely invulnerable to its effects. This immunity allows the pufferfish to drift through the violent world of the coral reef with a quiet, undeniable authority. Most predators, having survived a glancing encounter or having watched other predators die, have learned to recognize the distinct shape and slow swimming pattern of the pufferfish. They give it wide berth, their evolutionary instincts warning them that this slow-moving meal carries a catastrophic price. But chemistry is only half of the pufferfish's defensive arsenal. Even with immunity, being bitten by a predator is still a traumatic, potentially fatal event. The fish needed a way to ensure that a predator would not even attempt the first bite. To achieve this, it evolved one of the most spectacular, bizarre physical transformations in the animal kingdom. When a young, inexperienced predator, perhaps a reckless reef shark or a hungry grouper, ignores the warning signs and lunges with open jaws, the pufferfish does not try to outswim it. Instead, it activates its secondary defense mechanism. In a fraction of a second, the fish opens its mouth and begins rapidly gulping massive volumes of seawater. But this water does not pass through the gills, nor does it proceed into the digestive tract. It is forced directly into a highly specialized, hyperelastic stomach. This organ is folded like an accordion, built from tissues that can stretch to astonishing extremes. As the stomach fills with pressurized water, it expands violently outward, pushing against the fish's internal organs and stretching the skin. Before the predator's jaws can close, the small, slow-moving fish rapidly balloons to 3 or 4 times its original volume. It transforms into a massive, rigid, unswallowable sphere. But the inflation does more than simply increase the fish's size. As the skin stretches tight as a drum, dozens of sharp, hardened spines that normally lie flat and hidden beneath the surface are suddenly forced upright. They lock into place, turning the inflated sphere into a terrifying, aquatic pincushion. The predator is suddenly faced with an impossibly wide, rock-hard ball of spikes that cannot physically fit into its mouth or down its throat. If the predator attempts to bite down anyway, the sharp spines pierce its mouth, injecting trace amounts of the lethal tetrodotoxin directly into the wounds. The physical pain, combined with the sudden, terrifying numbness of the neurotoxin, forces the attacker to instantly abandon the hunt. The predator recoils, spitting out the spike sphere and darting away to recover. Slowly, carefully, the pufferfish relaxes its internal valves. It expels the trapped seawater, deflating back to its normal bulbous shape, and resumes its leisurely paddle across the reef as if nothing had happened. Yet, there's a hidden twist to this story of biological armament. The pufferfish, for all its brilliant genetic modifications, is not a chemist. It does not possess the internal machinery to synthesize tetrodotoxin on its own. Instead, it is a harvester. The lethal poison that makes the pufferfish untouchable actually originates from microscopic, symbiotic bacteria that live freely in the ocean and within the tissues of the fish's own prey. As the pufferfish goes about its daily life, grazing on the reef, it consumes these bacteria. Rather than destroying the microbes, the pufferfish's body carefully extracts the tetrodotoxin they produce, hoarding the chemical, concentrating it within its liver and skin over its lifetime. It is a spectacular evolutionary alliance. The fish provides a mobile home and a steady supply of nutrients to the bacteria. And in return, the bacteria provide the fish with the most powerful chemical shield on Earth. If a pufferfish is raised in a sterile laboratory environment, completely cut off from its toxic diet, it grows up entirely harmless, devoid of poison. But out here, in the wild, chaotic laboratory of the coral reef, the fish is a walking reservoir of borrowed death. Armed with this impenetrable defense, the pufferfish is free to occupy a unique and highly specialized ecological niche. It does not compete with the sleek, fast-swimming predators for small fish. Instead, it turns its attention to the heavily armored tanks of the invertebrate world. As it hovers over the coral rubble, it searches for crabs, snails, and sea urchins, creatures that rely on thick, calcium carbonate shells and sharp spines for protection. When the pufferfish finds a target, it reveals a final piece of its anatomical weaponry. It does not have individual teeth. Instead, its teeth have evolved into 4 solid, heavily fused plates that form a massive, incredibly powerful structure resembling the beak of a parrot, driven by dense, heavily muscled jaws. This beak is an absolute crushing machine. The pufferfish casually approaches a heavily armored crab. The crab raises its claws, but the pufferfish simply bites down. A sharp, echoing crack rings out through the water as the thick exoskeleton shatters like glass under the immense pressure of the fused beak. The fish easily crushes the shell, extracting the soft meat inside. It will even tackle the venomous, needle-like spines of a sea urchin, biting straight through the fences to crack open the central shell. Through this relentless, shell-crushing diet, the pufferfish serves as a critical regulator of the reef ecosystem. By consuming hard-shelled invertebrates, it prevents these grazers from overpopulating and decimating the delicate coral and sponge communities. It is a slow, methodical gardener, moving fearlessly through the shallows, breaking down armor and maintaining the fragile balance of the reef. And remarkably, despite the lethal nature of its flesh, the pufferfish still participates in the delicate social contracts of the underwater world. When parasites accumulate on its skin, the pufferfish will slowly drift into the territory of a cleaner shrimp. The tiny, translucent shrimp, highly sensitive to chemicals, recognizes the pufferfish. It approaches cautiously, climbing directly onto the skin that secretes the deadly neurotoxin, and begins meticulously picking away dead tissue and parasites. For reasons that science still struggles to fully explain, the cleaner shrimp operates completely unharmed, dancing lightly over a surface of concentrated venom. It is a stunning paradox of the reef, a moment of total peace and cooperation taking place on the back of a biological weapon. As the late afternoon sun sinks lower in the sky, the vibrant turquoise of the lagoon begins to shift into deeper, heavier shades of indigo. The frantic daytime activity of the reef slows, making way for the emergence of the nocturnal hunters. Moray eels slide from their crevices. Large sharks begin their twilight patrols. But the pufferfish does not panic. It does not wedge itself frantically into a hiding place. It simply drifts down toward a sheltered overhang, its small fins paddling gently to keep it stable in the cooling currents. Its large eyes watch the shadows moving in the dark, completely devoid of fear. Within its tissues, the silent, invisible molecules of tetrodotoxin wait, locked and loaded. Its mutated sodium channels continue to fire flawlessly, generating the electrical spark of life within a body saturated with death. In the vast, competitive arena of the ocean, where millions of species have invested everything into the arms race of bone, muscle, and speed, the pufferfish stands as a testament to a different kind of dominance. It is an animal that realizes that true invincibility does not come from outrunning your enemies or outmuscling them. True invincibility comes from mastering the microscopic geometry of a single protein, rewriting the laws of chemistry, and turning yourself into a living, breathing fortress that the rest of the ocean simply cannot touch. Along the cold, shadowed floor of the North Atlantic, the seabed is a vast, unforgiving expanse of fractured rock, broken shells, and drifting sediment. Here, the water is heavy and dark, moving in long, deliberate currents that sweep microscopic life through dim, blue light filtering down from the violent surface far above. It is a harsh, biting environment, defined by near-freezing temperatures and relentless physical forces. In the crevices of boulders and the narrow, hidden tunnels beneath limestone ledges, life must be heavily fortified just to survive the night. As the faint light of dusk fades from the water column, a creature emerges from its rocky fortress. It moves with deliberate, armored patience. Its body is a masterpiece of prehistoric engineering, blending perfectly into the rough, mottled textures of seafloor. This is the American lobster. As it crawls over the stones, it extends long, whip-like antennae forward, sweeping the dark water like living sensory cables. Every microscopic twitch of these antennae gathers incredibly detailed information from the surrounding ocean, tasting the faint chemical trails left behind by a crushed clam, a passing fish, or a lurking predator. Beneath its thick, rigid carapace, a specialized heart pumps hemolymph, a copper-based, pale blue blood, through its body, delivering oxygen extracted by feathery gills to dense, powerful muscles. It is heavily armed, wielding massive, crushing claws capable of shattering shells and severing bone. To the rest of the ocean, the lobster appears to be a standard, albeit formidable crustacean. It is a creature bound by the same biological rhythms that dictate the lives of every other animal on Earth. Youth, maturity, a slow, inevitable decline into weakness, and finally, death. But this assumption is entirely wrong. Hidden deep within the microscopic architecture of the lobster's cells is a biological anomaly, so profound that it actively defies the fundamental laws of aging. To understand the sheer impossibility of the lobster, we must first look at the biological clock that ticks inside the bodies of almost every other living thing, including humans. In most animals, the passage of time is not merely the ticking of a clock. It is a physical erosion. Our bodies are built from cells, and to maintain our tissues, these cells must constantly divide. Inside the nucleus of every cell, our genetic instructions are bundled into strands of DNA called chromosomes. At the very ends of these chromosomes are protective caps known as telomeres. You can think of them like the plastic aglets at the ends of a shoelace, preventing the delicate genetic thread from fraying and unraveling. But there is a fatal flaw in this system. Every single time a cell divides, the copying machinery cannot quite reach the very end of the strand. Consequently, with every division, the telomere is snipped slightly shorter. This shortening is the universal countdown of life. It is the molecular manifestation of aging. Over the course of years and decades, after thousands of cell divisions, the telomeres become perilously short. The protective caps wear away entirely. When this happens, the cell can no longer safely divide without damaging its vital DNA. It enters a state of senescence. It stops repairing itself. It begins to malfunction, and the tissue starts to degrade. The muscles weaken. The skin loses its elasticity. The organs falter. This is why animals grow old. This is why we die. But the American lobster refuses to participate in this biological decay. Deep within its tissues, the lobster operates under an entirely different set of molecular rules. Inside its cells, it manufactures a steady, relentless supply of a highly specialized enzyme called telomerase. In many animals, including humans, telomerase is only highly active during the very early embryonic stages of life, shutting down shortly after birth. But the lobster never turns a factory off. Throughout its entire life, every time one of its cells divides and the telomere is snipped short, the telomerase enzyme immediately swoops in and completely rebuilds the missing sequence. It patches the end of the chromosome, restoring the protective cap to its original length. Because of this continuous, active repair mechanism, the lobster's cellular clock never strikes midnight. Its DNA never frays. Its cells never enter senescence. This creates a terrifying and magnificent physiological reality. The American lobster does not age. A mature, 50-year-old lobster is not a frail, elderly version of its younger self. Its metabolism does not slow down. Its muscles do not atrophy. In fact, because its cells retain perfect vitality, the lobster actually becomes stronger, more heavily armored, and more biologically efficient as the decades pass. Its claws thicken into massive, bone-crushing weapons. Its reproductive organs remain highly active, with older females carrying tens of thousands of fertilized eggs, continuing to seed the ocean with life long past the point when a mammal would have succumbed to the evolutionary twilight of menopause. The lobster has achieved something akin to cellular immortality. It exhibits what biologists call negligible senescence. If you were to look at its tissues under a microscope, you would not be able to tell if the animal was 5 years old or a century old. The molecular decay of time has been completely neutralized. If this is true, then logic dictates that the seafloor should be overrun by immortal, giant lobsters the size of small vehicles. But the ocean is not a realm that allows anything to live forever. Evolution has given the lobster the gift of eternal youth, but it has trapped that gift inside a rigid, unforgiving mechanical prison. The lobster's superpower is cellular, but its vulnerability is physical. Unlike mammals, whose flexible skin stretches and grows alongside their internal skeletons, the lobster is encased in a fixed, rigid exoskeleton. This thick armor of chitin and calcium carbonate cannot stretch. It cannot expand. As the lobster's perpetually youthful cells continue to divide and its body mass increases, it eventually runs out of space inside its own shell. To survive, the lobster must undergo a terrifying, agonizing process known as molting. It is a biological gamble of the highest stakes. When the pressure inside the old shell becomes unbearable, the lobster secretes enzymes that begin to dissolve the innermost layers of its armor, separating its living flesh from the rigid casing. It furiously absorbs the calcium from its old shell, storing the minerals in its bloodstream to prevent waste. Then, retreating into the darkest, most inaccessible crevice it can find, the lobster splits the carapace down the back. What follows is an act of desperate extraction. The lobster must pull its entire, expanded body through a narrow opening. It has to rip its fleshy legs out of the armored joints, pull its sensitive antennae free from their tubes, and even shed the transparent lenses covering its eyes and the lining of its own stomach. When it finally pulls free, the animal is completely exhausted and terrifyingly vulnerable. It is now a soft-shell creature, its new armor possessing the consistency of wet paper. Without the rigid support of its exoskeleton, it can barely move or defend itself. A passing cod and octopus, or even another lobster, could easily tear it to pieces. To make matters worse, the lobster must immediately inflate its soft body by pumping massive volumes of seawater into its tissues. It stretches the new, pliable shell outward, making it up to 20% larger than the old one, ensuring there's room to grow before the next molt. It must sit shivering in the dark for days, completely defenseless, waiting for the stored calcium in its blood to crystallize and harden the new armor. When it is young, a lobster will perform this grueling, dangerous escape act multiple times a year. As it grows larger and the armor becomes thicker, the molt space out to once every few years. And this is where the lobster's biological paradox ultimately catches up with it. The lobster does not die because its cells wear out. It dies because of the crushing physics of its own continuous growth. As the decades pass, the lobster grows to massive proportions. Some captured specimens have weighed over 40 pounds, boasting claws capable of snapping a man's arm, their shells heavily scarred from half a century of deep-sea warfare. But with this incredible size comes an insurmountable metabolic tax. The energy required to absorb the minerals, separate the flesh, crack the massive shell, and pull a gigantic, heavy body through a narrow fissure increases exponentially with every single molt. Eventually, a day arrives when the ancient, massive lobster realizes it is out of space, but its body simply can no longer generate the sheer caloric energy required to complete the molting cycle. The animal reaches a mechanical limit. It initiates the molt. The shell splits, but the lobster lacks the strength to pull itself free. It becomes inextricably trapped inside its own armor. Unable to escape, unable to expand, the stress becomes catastrophic. The physiological systems fail, not from old age, but from absolute physical exhaustion. In other instances, the lobster may simply stop molting altogether, allowing its degrading shell to become infected with bacteria and disease, eventually succumbing to shell rot. It is a tragic, poetic end. The organism that conquered time at the microscopic level is ultimately killed by the inescapable physics of its own success. Yet, before they reach this mechanical breaking point, these massive, ancient lobsters act as the apex regulators of the benthic ecosystem. They patrol the rocky shelves with absolute dominance. Their massive claws easily shatter the shells of sea urchins, clams, and mussels, controlling the populations of invertebrates that would otherwise overrun the coastal seafloor. Their continuous vitality means that the oldest individuals are the most successful hunters and the most prolific breeders. A single ancient female, her cells firing with the exact same perfection as they did 50 years prior, will release millions of larvae into the planktonic currents over a lifetime, anchoring the survival of her entire species. This deep-sea scavenger poses one of the most profound questions in all of biology. If the degradation of aging can be completely halted by the continuous presence of an enzyme like telomerase, if an animal can live for a century without its cells ever growing weak, it means that aging is not an unbreakable rule of the universe. It is merely one evolutionary strategy among many. Death by old age is not inevitable. It is programmed, and the lobster somehow opted out of the program. Down in the frigid, crushing darkness of the North Atlantic, the lobster continues its slow, methodical crawl over the stones. Its antennae twitch, tasting the salt and the cold. Inside its armored body, deep within the invisible architecture of its nucleus, the molecular machinery hums with flawless precision. Telomeres are rebuilt. DNA is protected. Time is held completely at bay. The animal does not know that it holds the secret to cellular immortality. It only knows the scent of the prey ahead, the cold push of the ocean current, and the heavy, unyielding weight of the shell that protects it, the shell that will one distant day become its tomb. Along the violently contested margins where the ocean physically collides with the continents, the environment exists in a state of perpetual, rhythmic apocalypse. This is the intertidal zone, a shifting, bipolar landscape that completely rewrites its own reality every few hours. At high tide, it is a submerged, turbulent world of crashing waves and surging currents, pounded by the raw kinetic energy of the sea. At low tide, the water violently retreats, exposing a harsh, drying wasteland of jagged rocky ledges, isolated tidal pools, and baking sand flats. To survive here, an organism cannot simply be a marine animal, nor can it be entirely terrestrial. It must be a creature capable of enduring the extremes of both drowning and desiccation, of navigating the crushing weight of the water and the scorching radiation of the sun. In this theater of extremes, where barnacles cement themselves to stone and soft-bodied anemones fold inward to survive the drying air, moves one of the most successful and heavily fortified inhabitants of the shoreline. From the deep shadow of a submerged limestone crevice, an armored vanguard steps into the filtered light. It is a crab. It moves with a lateral, calculated precision, its jointed legs picking their way across the abrasive sand with mechanical efficiency. It pauses, raising its stalked eyes high above the sediment, rotating them independently to scan the rippling water for the shadow of a gull or the streamlined silhouette of a predatory fish. But it does not move with the skittish panic of a vulnerable prey item. It moves with the quiet, unyielding confidence of a creature encased entirely in a biological fortress. The shell of the crab, scientifically known as a carapace, is not mere decoration. It is an evolutionary masterpiece of defense. It is an external skeleton built from a complex matrix of chitin, a tough, flexible polymer that has been heavily mineralized and reinforced with dense crystalline layers of calcium carbonate. This creates a suit of armor that is staggeringly resilient. It deflects the sharp beaks of seabirds, resists the crushing jaws of coastal fish, and acts as a physical shield against the chaotic, abrasive tumbling of sand and stone when the surf crashes against the shore. It is a walking castle, armed with powerful hydraulic pincers capable of severing flesh and cracking open the shells of weaker animals. For the vast majority of the crab's life, this rigid, unyielding armor defines its absolute dominance within the coastal hierarchy. It allows the animal to be a fearless scavenger and a ruthless predator. But this magnificent, impenetrable armor harbors a dark, inescapable biological paradox. In the vertebrate world, in fish, birds, and mammals, the skeleton is internal. As the animal eats and its tissues expand, the internal bones grow seamlessly alongside the flesh. The architecture of the body accommodates its own expansion. But the crab skeleton is on the outside. It is a fixed, rigid, calcified box. Once the carapace hardens, it cannot stretch by so much as a fraction of a millimeter. It cannot yield. It cannot grow. As the crab consumes food and its internal biomass increases, it slowly begins to run out of space. The fortress becomes a suffocating prison. The animal's own successful survival begins to slowly crush it from the inside out. To solve this fatal geometric flaw, the crab must perform one of the most agonizing, terrifying, and spectacularly dangerous feats in the natural world. To continue living, to continue growing, it must completely abandon the very armor that keeps it alive. It must undergo the grueling biological ordeal of ectasis, the process of molting. The preparation for this catastrophic shedding begins weeks before the actual event. Deep inside the claustrophobic confines of its hardened shell, a silent, invisible alchemy is taking place. The crab's body begins to secrete a highly specialized cocktail of enzymes into microscopic space between its living tissue and the inner wall of the carapace. These enzymes act as a biological solvent, slowly eating away at the attachments, effectively dissolving the glue that holds the flesh to the bone. Simultaneously, the crab begins a desperate act of molecular hoarding. Calcium is a precious resource in the ocean, hard-won and metabolically expensive to produce. The crab cannot afford to simply throw its armor away, and so its bloodstream begins to actively strip the calcium out of its old shell, pulling the minerals back into its own hemolymph and storing them in specialized internal organs. The old shell slowly weakens, becoming brittle as its structural integrity is looted from within. Beneath this decaying outer hull, the epidermal cells are working frantically to weave a brand new skeleton. They lay down a fresh, intricately folded layer of pure chitin. But this new shell contains no calcium. It is entirely soft, wrinkled, and highly compressed, like a massive parachute packed tightly into a tiny bag. Eventually, the internal pressure becomes absolute. The crab can barely move. Its flesh is packed so tightly against the brittle inner walls of the old shell that feeding becomes impossible. The biological clock strikes zero. The molt must begin. The crab seeks out the darkest, most inaccessible, claustrophobic hiding place it can find. It wedges itself beneath a heavy slab of rock or burrows deep into the anoxic mud. It must be entirely hidden, because what is about to happen will strip away every defense it possesses. The crab begins to forcefully gulp massive quantities of seawater, intentionally driving its internal hydrostatic pressure through the roof. Its body swells violently against the weakened seams of the carapace. The tension builds to a breaking point until, with a sudden, silent physical snap, the old armor fractures. A horizontal fissure rips open across the back of the crab, exactly along a predetermined fault line. Where the carapace meets the abdomen, the escape route is open. But the extraction is a nightmare of biomechanics. The crab must literally pull itself out of itself. It begins to slowly back out of the shattered shell, but the armor is incredibly complex. The crab must withdraw its thick, heavily muscled claws to the impossibly narrow, rigid joints of the old arms. To accomplish this, the flesh inside the claws actually dehydrates, shrinking down into a flaccid, watery paste, so it can be squeezed to the microscopic pinholes of the exoskeleton joints without tearing. It is an act of agonizing biological contortion. The animal pulls its delicate, feathery gills out of their protective chambers. It carefully extracts its complex, stalked eyes from their rigid sockets. It even sheds the chitinous lining of its own stomach and the microscopic hairs that line its mouth parts. It leaves nothing behind. When the struggle finally ends, a process that can take hours of exhausting, uninterrupted effort, the crab pulls its final leg free and collapses next to its former self. Looking at the scene, one would see two identical crabs, but one is a hollow, ghostly apparition, a perfectly intact, translucent replica of the animal, empty and lifeless, and beside it lies the actual crab. But this newly emerged creature is not a heavily armored warrior. It is a soft, gelatinous mass of exposed flesh. Its new exoskeleton is the consistency of wet parchment. It is completely unable to support its own weight, unable to lift its claws, unable to defend itself against even the smallest threat. For the next several days, this apex scavenger of the tide pools is nothing more than helpless, exposed meat. If a predatory fish, an octopus, or even a seagull were to find it now, the crab would be instantly devoured. It has no physical means of resistance. It is existing in a state of absolute, terrifying vulnerability. Yet, the crab cannot simply wait for the new shell to harden. If the shell were to crystallize right now, it would harden at the exact same size as the old one, entirely defeating the purpose of the agonizing molt. The crab must perform one final, brilliant mechanical hack. While its new skin is still soft and incredibly pliable, the crab begins to relentlessly pump surrounding seawater directly into its tissues. It intentionally inflates itself. The soft, wrinkled chitin of the new exoskeleton stretches outward, ballooning rapidly. The crab swells to a size 20-30, sometimes 40% larger than the rigid ghost shell it just left behind. It becomes a bloated, water-filled giant. It stretches a new armor to its absolute maximum volumetric capacity, essentially casting a larger mold for its future self. Now, the terrifying waiting game begins. Hidden in the absolute darkness of its crevice, the crab remains perfectly still. It stops pumping water. It stops eating. It barely breathes. Inside its body, the biological factories shift into overdrive. The massive reserves of calcium that the crab looted from its old shell and stored in its blood are suddenly released. The minerals flood the circulatory system, rushing into the soft, inflated matrix of the new chitin. Microscopic crystals of calcium carbonate begin to form, locking the flexible fibers together. Hour by hour, the wet parchment begins to stiffen. The armor calcifies. The soft, vulnerable balloon of flesh slowly turns back into an impenetrable fortress. This window of terror, this period where the crab is a soft-shell ghost, typically lasts between 2 to 3 days. It is a harrowing span of time that fundamentally alters the ecological dynamics of the entire coastline. Predators possess a profound, instinctual understanding of this biological cycle. Many coastal hunters, such as stingrays and specialized bottom-feeding fish, actively scan the reef not for the hard, unyielding clicks of an armor crab, but for the chemical scent of the molting fluid. They know that a soft-shell crab represents a massive, energy-dense meal that requires zero effort to crack. The molting season turns the shoreline into a hyper-lethal hunting ground, where crabs must time their physiological explosions flawlessly with the tidal cycles and the dark phases of the moon to avoid detection. Furthermore, this desperate vulnerability dictates the crab's entire social and reproductive life, because their rigid armor prevents them from mating normally. Female crabs of many species can only reproduce during the exact window when they have just molted and their shells are entirely soft. This creates a spectacular, high-stakes biological drama. Weeks before a female is ready to molt, a heavily armored male will find her, physically grab her, and cradle her beneath his own body in a protective embrace known as mate guarding. He carries her like a shield, defending her fiercely against rival males and predators. He waits patiently until the exact moment she splits her shell and pulls herself free as a soft, helpless mass. Only then, in the brief window before her new armor crystallizes, do they mate. He then continues to stand guard over her fragile body in the dark, using his own hardened claws to protect her until her new shell turns to stone, ensuring the survival of the next generation. As the 48-hour window finally closes, the transformation reaches its completion. The crab, hidden beneath the rocky ledge, tests its limbs. The joints click. The claws snap shut with a sharp, resonant sound of heavy stone. The armor is fully calcified, thicker and vastly more expansive than the shell that imprisoned it days before. It slowly expels the excess sea water it used to inflate itself, replacing the liquid volume with dense, growing muscle tissue. It is larger, stronger, and once again, practically invincible against the daily hazards of the intertidal zone. The crab steps out from the shadows of its crevice, leaving the brittle, dissolving ghost of its former self behind. That empty shell will soon break down in the surf, returning its residual calcium to the ocean, where it will be absorbed by algae, consumed by snails, and integrated back into the endless, recycling machinery of the coastal food web. The tide begins to turn, rushing back over the sand flats, crashing against the limestone with a deafening roar. The water churns with abrasive grit and overwhelming force. But the crab does not retreat. It lowers its heavy carapace, digs its newly forged, razor-sharp legs into the sediment, and raises its massive claws toward the current. It has survived the ultimate gamble. It has walked the terrifying line between growth and death, deliberately stripping away its only defense in order to conquer the limits of its own biology. In the vile and unforgiving arena where the ocean meets the earth, the crab resumes its slow, armored march, a creature that proves that to become a giant, one must first possess the courage to become entirely defenseless. In the shallow, sunlit lagoons of the tropical ocean, the coral reef rises from the seafloor like a sprawling, submerged metropolis. It is a labyrinth of living limestone, plunging canyons and intricate, shadowed crevices. Sunlight cascades through the crystal-clear water, scattering across the architecture in shifting ribbons of gold and turquoise. This is a crowded, hyper-competitive ecosystem. Everywhere you look, there is movement. Neon-colored fish dart through the coral branches like liquid electricity. Heavy-shelled mollusks drag themselves across the sediment, while heavily armored crabs tuck themselves into the rocky rubble, trusting in their thick, calcified exoskeletons to protect them from the relentless hunger of the reef. In this environment, survival usually dictates one of two strategies. You must either be fast enough to outswim the jaws of death, or heavily armored enough to break the teeth of anything that tries to eat you. But tucked away in a dark, narrow burrow carved directly into the coral rubble, there's a predator that laughs at the concept of armor. If you were to peer into this burrow, the first thing you would see are the eyes. They sit perched on the ends of independent, highly mobile stalks, swiveling and twitching with a frantic, hyper-calculated mechanical precision. They do not move together. One eye might track the shadow of a passing ray overhead, while the other locks onto the microscopic twitch of shrimp in the sand below. When the creature finally emerges from its hole, it does not look like a monster. It is remarkably small, often no longer than a human hand, its segmented body resembling an elongated, aquatic insect. It is cloaked in a vibrant, almost hallucinogenic array of colors, electric blues, vivid greens, and startling reds that shimmer in the filtered sunlight. It looks delicate. It looks like a beautiful, fragile ornament of the reef. This is the Mantis Shrimp, and its vibrant, harmless appearance conceals a biological weapon of such terrifying, physics-defying violence that it forces us to rethink the very limits of animal anatomy. The Mantis Shrimp does not hunt by poison. It does not hunt by stealth, nor does it slowly pry its victims apart with heavy claws. The Mantis Shrimp hunts by unleashing an act of raw, catastrophic kinetic energy. Tucked neatly beneath its colorful thorax are two specialized appendages, folded up like the arms of a praying mantis. But these are not grasping claws. They are heavily mineralized, densely packed biological clubs. They are ballistic impact weapons. Imagine a heavily armored crab wandering too close to the shrimp's burrow. The crab is confident in its thick, calcium carbonate shell, a fortress that protects it from the probing jaws of fish and the grip of octopuses. The Mantis Shrimp tracks the crab with its astonishing eyes. It waits for the perfect angle, and then it strikes. The movement of the club is so blisteringly fast that it is entirely invisible to the naked human eye. It is powered by a microscopic biological mechanism that functions exactly like a crossbow. Inside the shrimp's arm, an incredibly powerful muscle contracts, building up massive amount of elastic tension in a specialized saddle-shaped spring embedded in the exoskeleton. A biological latch holds this tension in check until the pressure reaches a critical maximum. When the latch finally releases, the energy is discharged all at once. The club accelerates outward with the speed and force of a .22 caliber bullet, leaving the barrel of the gun. It travels through the water at over 50 miles per hour, reaching its target in less than 3 milliseconds. But the physical impact of the club against the crab shell is only the first part of the violence. The Mantis Shrimp moves its weapon through the water so incredibly fast that it violates the physical properties of the liquid around it. The club tears the water apart, creating an area of such extreme negative pressure behind it that the water literally boils at room temperature. This creates a cavity of superheated vapor, a phenomenon known in fluid dynamics as a cavitation bubble. When the club strikes the crab, the shell shatters instantly, but a fraction of a millisecond later, the cavitation bubble collapses in on itself. The implosion of this bubble generates a secondary shockwave of unfathomable power. As the vapor collapses, the temperature inside the bubble briefly spikes to thousands of degrees, nearly as hot as the surface of the sun, and emits a microscopic flash of light, a phenomenon called sonoluminescence. The crab is hit twice, first by a biological hammer, and then by a thermodynamic shock wave. The armor explodes. The prey is instantly stunned or killed outright. The force is so overwhelming that even if the Mantis Shrimp physically misses its target by a fraction of an inch, the collapsing shockwave of the cavitation bubble alone is enough to blow the crab apart. This display of ballistic destruction immediately introduces the profound, seemingly unsolvable paradox of physics. Newton's third law of motion dictates that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. If you swing a hammer into a solid concrete wall with enough force to shatter the stone, the kinetic energy rebounds. If the hammer is not strong enough, the handle breaks or the steel shatters. The Mantis Shrimp is striking heavily armored, rock-hard shells with the force of a bullet, generating heat, light, and explosive shock waves. By all the laws of physics, the shrimp's own club should instantly explode into microscopic fragments upon impact. The biological recoil should tear its own arm off. Yet, the Mantis Shrimp can execute this strike thousands of times over the course of its life without suffering a single microfracture. How does a living organism build a weapon that can survive its own apocalyptic force? The answer was hidden from human understanding until scientists placed the club of a Mantis Shrimp under powerful electron microscopes, peeling back the layers of its anatomy to the nanometer scale. What they found inside was an architecture of such staggering brilliance that it has single-handedly revolutionized the field of modern material science. The club is not a solid block of bone or shell. It is a highly complex, multi-layered composite structure. The very outer layer, the impact zone, is heavily calcified and heavily mineralized, providing a dense, incredibly hard striking surface. But the true genius lies beneath this outer shell. The core of the club is constructed from microscopic fibers of chitin, the same material that makes up the shells of insects and crabs. But the mantis shrimp does not lay these fibers down in straight, flat sheets. Instead, it weaves them together in a highly specific, rotating geometric pattern known as a herringbone structure. The fibers zigzag back and forth, layering over one another in a spiraling, staircase-like arrangement, binding with calcium carbonate and specialized proteins. To understand why this is a masterpiece of impact resistance, we have to look at how things break. When a rigid material like glass or bone or a standard crab shell is struck with extreme force, a microscopic crack forms. Because the material is uniform, that crack travels in a straight line, tearing through structure at the speed of sound, resulting in a sudden, catastrophic shattering. But when the shock wave of the mantis shrimp strike hits its own club, the energy attempts to form a crack. The crack begins to move, but it instantly hits the twisting, spiraling layers of the herringbone chitin. The crack cannot travel in a straight line. It is forced to follow the twisting path of the fibers. It zigzags, turning corners, changing directions over and over again. Every time the crack changes direction, it is robbed of its kinetic energy. The destructive force is dissipated, scattered, and absorbed by the internal architecture of the club before it can cause a catastrophic failure. It is a biological shock absorber of unparalleled efficiency. The club takes the apocalyptic force of the impact and gently diffuses it into the surrounding tissues. It is a structure so flawlessly engineered to resist high-velocity impacts that aerospace engineers and military researchers are currently mapping its geometry to design the next generation of combat armor, aircraft hulls, and impact-resistant vehicle panels. Human engineering is desperately trying to copy the blueprints of a 6-inch crustacean. But a weapon of this magnitude is entirely useless if you cannot aim it. The explosive speed of the club requires a targeting system of unimaginable precision. This brings us back to the eyes. The visual system of the mantis shrimp makes human vision look like a crude black and white sketch. Humans perceive the world using 3 types of color-receptive cones in our eyes, allowing us to see the spectrum from red to violet. A dog has 2. A butterfly has 5. The mantis shrimp has 16. It can see color spectrums that the human brain cannot even begin to conceptualize. It sees deep into the ultraviolet range. It can detect polarized light and even circularly polarized light, a visual capability practically unheard of in the rest of the animal kingdom. The structure of its eyes is divided into 3 distinct bands, giving the shrimp trinocular vision in each individual eye. This means it can perceive flawless depth perception and distance with just one eye, while the other eye scans a reef for threats. This alien, hyper-advanced sensory array is what turns the mantis shrimp into an infallible sniper. It can look at a heavily camouflaged crab hiding against a similarly colored rock and instantly see it glowing in ultraviolet or polarized light. It can look at the curved shell of the snail, calculate the precise thickness of the calcium carbonate, identify the structural weak point of the armor, and calculate the exact trajectory and distance required for the club to shatter it. It sees the microscopic flaws in the defenses of its enemies, and it exploits them with ballistic prejudice. This combination of advanced optics and devastating kinetic power dramatically alters the ecological balance of the reef. The mantis shrimp occupies a niche that few other predators can claim. Hard-shelled invertebrates like clams, large snails, and heavily armored crabs dedicate their entire evolutionary existence to building shells thick enough to survive the jaws of a grouper or the beak of an octopus. They anchor themselves to the rock, trusting their fortresses. The mantis shrimp treats these fortresses like glass. It regulates the populations of the most heavily armored grazers on the reef, ensuring that these hard-shelled organisms do not overrun the environment. It cracks open the untouchables, leaving a trail of shattered shells in the sand outside its burrow. And yet, despite possessing a weapon capable of instant death, the mantis shrimp utilizes a remarkable degree of restraint when dealing with its own kind. These are fiercely territorial animals. Good burrows in the reef are rare, and competition between mantis shrimp is intense. When two rival shrimp encounter each other, a fight is inevitable. But if they were to simply strike each other with full force, both would likely die. Their internal organs turn to paste by the shock waves. Instead, they engage in highly ritualized, highly calculated combat. They spar. One shrimp will coil its body, presenting the heavily armored, thickest part of its tail as a shield. The rival will strike the tail with its club. It is a test of strength, a way to gauge the power and size of the opponent without causing lethal damage. The herringbone architecture of the tail armor absorbs a blow, just as a club absorbs the recoil. They trade strikes, testing the limits of each other's composite armor, until the weaker shrimp concedes the territory and retreats into the blue. It is a violent, percussive dance, a display of evolutionary respect between two biological cannons. As the sun arcs across the sky, casting long, shifting shadows through the canyons of the reef, the frantic activity of the lagoon continues. Schools of fish surge and scatter. Octopuses pour themselves into dark crevices. The eternal arms race of speed, stealth, and armor marches endlessly onward. But down in the rubble, at the mouth of a dark, narrow burrow, the mantis shrimp sits perfectly still. Its stalked eyes swivel, breaking the light into 16 different dimensions, painting a hyperspectral map of the battlefield. Beneath its brightly colored thorax, the biological springs are tightly wound. The latches are set. The composite herringbone clubs are locked and ready. It is an organism entirely unconcerned with the defenses of the world around it. It does not need to be big. It does not need to be fast. It is a creature that has mastered the physics of destruction, sitting quietly in the shadows, waiting for a precise moment to pull the trigger and shatter the unbreakable. In the warm, sun-drenched shallows of the tropical coastline, where the land bleeds slowly into the sea, a vastly different kind of underwater architecture takes shape. Here, massive mangrove trees plunge their thick, tangled roots directly into the tide, creating a submerged, twisting forest of wood and shadow. The water is clear, shallow, and seemingly inviting. Shafts of sunlight pierce the surface, illuminating drifting particles and the synchronized flashes of silver baitfish weaving through the wooden labyrinth. It is an environment of intense physical complexity. To navigate this dense, three-dimensional obstacle course of roots, rocks, and swaying seagrass, an animal must possess sharp senses, rapid reflexes, and, above all, a highly centralized command center, a brain capable of processing spatial data, calculating distance, and issuing instantaneous muscular commands. For as long as we have studied biology, we have operated under a singular, unbreakable assumption. Complex behavior requires a brain. Intelligence, navigation, and deliberate hunting are the exclusive domains of the centralized mind. But drifting silently through the dappled light of the mangrove channels is a creature that shatters this fundamental rule of life. At first glance, it hardly looks like an animal at all. It appears as an apparition, a fragile, nearly invisible cube of translucent gelatin pulsating softly in the current. Trailing beneath its bell are long, shimmering tentacles that look like threads of spun glass, catching the light as they sweep through the water. This is the box jellyfish. If you were to watch it for just a moment, you might dismiss it as a passive drifter, a brainless organism completely at the mercy of the tides, entirely unsuited for the complex, treacherous environment of the coastal shallows. But watch it longer, and the illusion of passive drifting vanishes. The box jellyfish does not crash blindly into the tangled mangrove roots. It approaches a dark, vertical pillar of wood, pauses, and then deliberately adjusts its pulsing rhythm to steer gracefully around it. It actively corrects its orientation when pushed off balance by a sudden surge in the current. It regulates its depth, migrating up and down the water column in direct response to the shifting intensity of the sun. It actively pursues the frantic movements of tiny, fast-swimming fish, angling its delicate bell to intercept them. It exhibits intent. It solves spatial problems. It navigates. It hunts. Yet, if you were to capture this creature and look inside its translucent tissues, you would find a biological impossibility. There is no brain. There is no centralized nervous system, no spinal cord, no gray matter, no single command center orchestrating these complex maneuvers. The box jellyfish is a hollow bell of water and thin tissue. How does a creature with no brain possess a mind? How does a hollow ghost navigate a forest? The answer lies in an evolutionary architecture that is entirely alien to the vertebrate world. The box jellyfish has not centralized its intelligence. It has distributed it. It operates not as a single, top-down organism controlled by a master brain, but as a flawlessly synchronized biological network. It is a creature built entirely out of independent, localized processing nodes. To understand this decentralized mind, we must look closely at the physical structure of the animal. Suspended at each of the four lower corners of its cube-shaped bell is a tiny, club-like structure known as a rhopalium. These four structures are the sensory hubs of the jellyfish, and they contain an array of optical hardware that is staggeringly sophisticated for a creature without a brain. Most simple jellyfish possess only basic pigment spots, primitive light sensors that can barely tell the difference between up and down, day and night. But within the four rhopalia of the box jellyfish sits a collection of 24 distinct eyes. And these are not just simple light sensors. Some of these eyes are highly complex, featuring actual corneas, perfectly shaped spherical lenses, and retinas. They are image-forming eyes, remarkably similar in design to the eyes of a fish or human. Some point upward, constantly monitoring the surface of the water and the canopy of the sky. Others point inward and downward, scanning the immediate underwater environment. These four sensory hubs gather an immense amount of visual and spatial data every single second. But because there is no central brain to send this information to, the processing must happen exactly where the data is collected. Each rhopalium acts as a localized microprocessor. When the complex eyes in the forward-facing rhopalium detect the sudden, dark vertical contrast of a mangrove root looming in the water, the visual information does not travel to a central hub for analysis. The rhopalium itself instantly processes the image, recognizes the obstacle, and directly fires an electrical command into specific muscles located in its own quadrant of the bell. The muscles on that side of the jellyfish contract with a slightly different rhythm, altering the hydrodynamics of the pulse, and the animal smoothly veers away from the root. It is a form of distributed intelligence. The four corners of the jellyfish are essentially talking to the muscular tissue around them, making localized, independent decisions that somehow seamlessly integrate into a single, coordinated movement. The animal is constantly balancing the inputs from its four corners, correcting its pitch, steering away from threats, and maintaining its upright orientation, using microscopic, gravity-sensitive crystals tumbling within the rhopalia. It manages all of this through a web of decentralized nerve nets that connect the hubs, allowing them to share vital signals without ever requiring a master controller to dictate the action. The box jellyfish has engineered a biological internet, a network of nodes that work in absolute, thoughtless harmony. This distributed architecture gives the box jellyfish a terrifying advantage when it comes to capturing its prey. A creature without jaws, claws, or the ability to give chase must possess an alternative method for securing a meal, especially when that meal consists of highly advanced, fast-swimming vertebrates like fish. The jellyfish accomplishes this through an arsenal of microscopic, chemical weaponry deployed along its trailing tentacles. The glass-like threads dragging beneath the bell are lined with millions of specialized, explosive cells known as nematocysts. These are biological landmines. Coiled tightly inside each microscopic cell is a tiny, hollow harpoon bathed in one of the most complex, devastating venom cocktails in the natural world. When a passing fish accidentally brushes against a nearly invisible tentacle, the physical contact triggers an instant mechanical reaction. The localized nerve net does not need to ask the brain for permission to fire. The nematocysts explode outward with an acceleration faster than a bullet, leaving a gun. Millions of microscopic harpoons puncture the scales and skin of the fish simultaneously, pumping venom directly into the victim's bloodstream. The venom of the box jellyfish is a masterpiece of biochemical destruction, because a jellyfish has no physical way to hold on to a struggling, thrashing fish. A struggle that would instantly tear its delicate, watery tissues to shreds. The venom must act as an absolute instantaneous off-switch. It contains highly potent neurotoxins and cardiotoxins that immediately short-circuit the prey's nervous system and catastrophically disrupt the electrical signals of its heart. The fish is paralyzed almost the exact millisecond it touches a tentacle. Its heart stops, its muscles lock. The struggle is over before it even begins. Once the prey is immobilized, the localized nerve net in that specific tentacle coordinates a slow, rhythmic contraction, drawing the paralyzed fish upward toward the center of the bell, where the jellyfish's mouth waits to engulf and dissolve the meal. The other 3 quadrants of the jellyfish continue pulsing normally, completely unbothered by the feeding process happening on one side of the body. The rhopalia keep monitoring the light, keeping the animal upright, ensuring that the hunt does not compromise the navigation of the whole. This leads to the most profound evolutionary advantage of abandoning a centralized brain. In the violent, unpredictable world of the ocean, the box jellyfish has achieved an extraordinary level of physical resilience through pure redundancy. In a vertebrate animal, a fish, a bird, a human, the brain is the ultimate single point of failure. It is the king of the body, hoarding all the processing power and all the control. If the brain is severely damaged, the entire organism instantly collapses. The heart stops pumping, the lungs stop breathing, the muscles go slack. The system cannot survive the loss of its headquarters. But the box jellyfish has no headquarters. Its mind is everywhere and nowhere. If a predatory sea turtle sweeps through the shallows and takes a massive bite out of the jellyfish, tearing away a large section of the bell and completely destroying one of the rhopalia, the animal does not go into systemic shock. It does not die. The destruction of one sensory hub does not shut down the others. The remaining 3 rhopalia continue to function flawlessly. They continue to process light. They continue to detect gravity. They continue to issue muscular commands to the surviving tissues. The box jellyfish simply adjusts its pulsing rhythm to compensate for the missing flesh and swims away. It survives a catastrophic, maiming injury because its intelligence is backed up in multiple, independent locations. By refusing to put all of its neurological resources into a single, vulnerable organ, the jellyfish becomes a creature that can literally be torn to pieces and still retains ability to navigate the world. As the long, slow afternoon gives way to dusk, the sunlight filtering through the mangrove canopy begins to fade. The water takes on a heavier, darker hue. Shadows lengthen across the submerged roots, and the nocturnal predators of the coast begin to stir. For the box jellyfish, the shifting light is an immediate, localized command. The upper-facing eyes in the rhopalia detect the dimming of the sky. The nodes process the data and send rhythmic signals into the bell. Slowly, deliberately, the transparent cube adjusts its buoyancy and begins its nightly migration, sinking deeper into the water column, gliding silently into the darker, safer channels of the reef. It leaves no wake. It makes no sound. It is an organism of absolute, terrifying elegance. We look at the animal kingdom, and we judge intelligence by the size of a brain, by the complexity of a centralized cortex. We assume that to have intent, to solve a maze of routes, to hunt with precision, there must be a singular eye driving the machine. But the box jellyfish glides through the dark water as a flawless contradiction. It is an animal that navigates the physical world with the expertise of a predator, yet possesses no center of thought. It is a collective, a drifting network of microscopic cameras, localized processors, and ballistic venom, operating in a state of perfectly decentralized harmony. In the tangled, shadowed waters of the tropical coast, the box jellyfish endures as a beautiful, lethal reminder that the ocean plays by its own rules, and that nature can build a perfectly functioning mind without ever bothering to build a brain. Far beyond the protective, sunlit fringes of the coral reefs and miles past the abrasive, grinding battlegrounds of the coastal shores, the ocean drops away into a realm of terrifying, absolute scale. This is the pelagic zone, the great, open wilderness of the deep blue. To the human eye, staring out from the deck of a ship, this endless expanse appears uniform. It looks like a static, unchanging desert water, stretching uninterrupted toward a curved horizon. But this uniformity is an illusion. The open ocean is not a stable environment. It is a chaotic, three-dimensional atmosphere of liquid. Here, massive underwater rivers, currents hundreds of miles wide, carve invisible highways through the abyss. The temperature of the water can fluctuate wildly from 1 mile to the next. The availability of food is governed by the erratic, shifting cycles of the global climate. Prey does not stay in one place. Vast schools of fish and migratory squid populations rise, fall, and vanish entirely as oceanographic conditions shift over years and decades. In this unpredictable, shifting void, evolutionary adaptations like thick armor, lethal venom, or phase-shifting tissues are not enough. If you are heavily armored but cannot find food, your armor simply becomes a beautifully sculpted coffin. If you are blisteringly fast, but swim in the wrong direction across 1,000 miles of empty water, your speed only hastens your starvation. To survive the vastness of the open ocean, an apex predator requires an adaptation far more profound than muscle or bone. It requires an invisible fortress. It requires the power of generational memory. Cutting through the rolling swells, an enormous, jet-black dorsal fin slices the surface of the water like an obsidian blade. It rises nearly 6 feet into the air, a stark, unmistakable silhouette against the gray horizon. Beneath it, a massive, perfectly streamlined body effortlessly paces the surging waves. Bold, stark patches of brilliant white break up the pitch-black canvas of its skin, a masterpiece of disruptive camouflage designed to confuse prey in the dappled light of the upper ocean. This is the orca, the killer whale. Despite the legendary moniker, it is not a whale at all, but the largest, most formidable member of the dolphin family. To look at an orca is to look at the absolute pinnacle of marine physical evolution. They possess jaws capable of crushing the spines of great white sharks. They have the explosive speed to run down the fastest marine mammals on Earth. They are apex predators in every sense of the word, completely unbothered by any other creature in the sea. But the true dominance of the orca does not reside in its teeth, its size, or its speed. The absolute, unyielding power of this animal lies hidden behind the dark curve of its skull. It lies in the mind. The orca survives not by brute force, but by functioning as a highly complex, deeply bonded cultural network. An orca does not wander the ocean alone. From the very moment it draws its first breath at the surface, it is bound to a family unit, a pod. And unlike the loose, temporary aggregations of many other fish and marine mammals, the bonds within an orca pod are permanent. They are forged in blood, sustained by a shared language, and governed by a hierarchy that revolves entirely around a single central figure. At the absolute heart of the pod swims the matriarch. She is often the oldest female in the group, a massive battle-scarred veteran of the ocean who has long since passed her reproductive years. In the brutal mathematics of nature, animals that can no longer reproduce are often discarded by evolution, their biological purpose fulfilled. But in the society of the orca, a post-reproductive female becomes the most valuable asset the pod possesses. She does not lead by physical intimidation. She leads because her brain is a living, breathing archive of oceanic history. The matriarch may be 60, 70, or even 80 years old. Over the course of half a century navigating the endless blue, she has witnessed phenomena that the younger members of her pod have never seen. She has lived through cyclic, decade-long shifts in global temperatures. She has seen the catastrophic collapse of fish populations and the sudden, unpredictable migrations of marine mammals. Every single one of these events, every shift in the current, every hidden underwater canyon that once held food during a famine, is meticulously cataloged in her vast, highly folded cerebral cortex. In an environment where the map is constantly being erased and redrawn by the climate, her memory is the only map that matters. As the pod travels, they do not swim in silence. The open ocean is a dark place, and vision quickly fails as light is absorbed by the depths. To stay connected across miles of open water, the orcas rely on an acoustic landscape of breathtaking complexity. They speak. The water around the pod constantly vibrates with rapid, echoing chorus of pulse calls, high-pitched whistles, and sharp, percussive clicks. This is not random noise. The vocalizations of an orca pod are incredibly structured. In fact, different pods possess entirely different acoustic dialects. An orca from a pod in the North Pacific sounds completely alien to an orca from a pod in the North Atlantic. Even neighboring families that cross paths in the same waters speak with distinct, recognizable accents, passing these specific vocal traditions down from mother to calf over generations. It is a true, undeniable form of animal culture. This acoustic web binds a family together, allowing them to coordinate their movements with the synchronized precision of a single massive organism. Today, the pod is hunting. They are approaching a turbulent, highly active boundary layer in the ocean, a convergence zone where freezing, nutrient-rich upwelling collides violently with a warm, offshore current. The water here is cloudy, thick with microscopic life, and visibility is practically zero. The matriarch slows her pace. She does not rely on her eyes. Instead, she unleashes a rapid volley of echolocation clicks. These sharp bursts of sound rip through the water at over 3,000 miles per hour, bouncing off invisible thermoclines, scanning the topography of the seafloor hundreds of feet below. When the sound waves strike an object, they reflect back, painting a flawless, three-dimensional acoustic image directly into the matriarch's brain. Suddenly, the echoes return with a dense, solid signature. Ahead of them, hidden entirely within the murky convergence zone, is a massive school of migrating salmon. The salmon are instinctively packed together in a tight, swirling defensive formation, a biological tornado of silver scales designed to confuse predators. For a solitary hunter, breaking into this dense, coordinated massive fish would be an exercise in futility. But the orca pod is not a collection of solitary hunters. They are a tactical strike team, and the matriarch is the orchestrator. Through a series of rapid, modulated calls, the pod instantly changes formation. They fan out, spreading into a wide, strategic crescent. The younger, faster males dive deep, swimming hundreds of feet below the salmon, effectively sealing off any avenue of downward escape. The females flank the sides, tightening the perimeter. The matriarch hangs slightly back, observing the acoustic chaos, issuing subtle vocal corrections to ensure the trap is perfectly set. Slowly, deliberately, the orcas begin to herd the salmon. They blow massive, localized curtains of bubbles, creating walls of air that the panicked fish refuse to cross. They flash the bright white undersides of their bodies, using their disruptive camouflage to startle and direct the swirling mass of prey, pushing them higher and higher toward the absolute barrier of the ocean's surface. The salmon are corralled into an incredibly tight, terrified bait ball. They have nowhere left to run. Then the execution begins. The orcas do not simply charge blindly into the center of the mass. That would scatter the fish and ruin the trap. Instead, they take turns. One by one, an orca accelerates into the silver tornado, using its powerful tail flukes not to bite, but to deliver a devastating concussive slap to the water. The kinetic shockwave stuns dozens of salmon instantly. The stunned fish drift helplessly out of the spinning school, where they are calmly and methodically consumed. Throughout the entire violent ballet, the pod structure remains absolutely disciplined. The youngest calves, still learning the complex mechanics of the hunt, stay safely glued to their mother's sides. They watch. They listen. They are absorbing the tactical geometry of the attack, internalizing specific acoustic calls, learning the traditions that they will one day pass down to their own offspring. This is not instinct. This is education. But the true value of this cultural transmission is not realized during times of plenty. It is realized during the apocalypse. The ocean is currently undergoing terrifying, rapid transformations. Driven by changing climate systems, anomalies known as marine heat waves occasionally sweep across the ocean. These massive blobs of superheated water act like a biological desert, completely destroying the microscopic phytoplankton that form the base of the food web. When a heat wave strikes, the entire ecosystem collapses from the bottom up. The bait fish vanish. The salmon runs fail. The coastal feeding grounds turn barren and empty. For many apex predators, a sudden disruption of this magnitude is a death sentence. A shark cannot invent a new ocean. A solitary hunter, driven purely by genetic instinct, will return to the same empty hunting grounds over and over again, circling the barren waters until it simply starves to death. Instinct is rigid. It cannot adapt to sudden, catastrophic change. But the orca pod possesses the ultimate evolutionary failsafe, the ancient memory of the matriarch. As the heat wave devastates their traditional hunting grounds, the younger members of the pod begin to experience the slow, terrifying onset of starvation. They look to the matriarch, and deep within her mind, a memory from decades ago is accessed. She remembers a time, perhaps 50 years prior, when she was just a calf swimming beside her own mother, and the ocean grew hot and empty just like this. She remembers how her mother led them away from the dying coast, navigating blindly across hundreds of miles of deep, featureless ocean to a hidden, deep water trench where cold currents still provided refuge for massive schools of squid and deep-sea fish. It is a location that none of the other living members of the pod have ever seen. It exists entirely outside of their collective experience. It lives only in the mind of the oldest female. With a decisive shift in direction, the matriarch calls out to her family, and she begins to swim. She leads her pod away from the barren shores, charting a course across the open void based on a mental map drawn half a century ago. They travel for days, ignoring their exhaustion, following the unwavering confidence of their leader. And finally, in the middle of a seemingly empty ocean, they dive. Down in the darkness, precisely where the matriarch remembered it would be, lies the deep water trench. It is teeming with life. The pod eats. The starvation is broken. The family survives. Scientific observations of varying orca populations have confirmed this stunning reality. During years of severe ecological upheaval, pods that are led by older, highly experienced females have dramatically higher survival rates than pods that have lost their matriarchs. The younger groups, lacking the deep historical archive of an elder, wander aimlessly and often succumb to famine. The groups led by ancient mothers thrive. The difference between life and death does not lie in the sharpness of their teeth or the thickness of their blubber. It lies entirely in the transmission of accumulated knowledge. As the sun bleeds into the horizon, casting a heavy, bruised purple twilight across the vast expanse of the open sea, the pod surfaces one final time before the darkness takes hold. The massive black dorsal fins cut through the glassy water in perfect, synchronized rhythm. Plumes of warm breath catch the fading light, drifting away on the cold ocean wind. They are apex predators, yes, but they are something far more profound. They are the keepers of the ocean's history. In a world defined by unpredictable, violent change, where physical adaptations can be rendered useless overnight by a shifting current or a warming sea, the orca relies on an entirely different kind of evolution. They have built a fortress that cannot be crushed by pressure, dissolved by chemistry, or broken by the climate. It is a fortress constructed from the invisible architecture of sound, bound by the unbreakable ties of family, and guarded fiercely by the ancient, enduring memory of a matriarch. Out here in the endless, shifting void, they survive not just because they're strong, but because they remember. The natural world is as unforgiving as it is spectacular. If you appreciate high-quality, deep-dive explorations into the unknown, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This is Earth's Documentary. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter.